They were young, they were innocent, and in a moment of unimaginable cruelty, their lives were stolen. For years, these murders left families shattered, communities gripped by fear, and detectives chasing ghosts in the dark. But evil can't always hide forever. Thanks to tireless investigation, stunning breakthroughs in DNA technology, and families who refused to let these stories fade, justice was finally served. In this video, we'll uncover 5 chilling murder cases of young girls that were once thought unsolvable, but were cracked open in ways no one expected. Watch until the end to see how each mystery was finally solved, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more true crime stories that reveal how darkness meets its reckoning. This is 5 solved murder cases that shook the world. Harvard University, a name that conjures prestige, power, and secrecy. Behind its storied gates lies a world few ever truly understand. A world of ambition, intellect, and, on a bitter January morning in 1969, something far darker. It was supposed to be just another snowy Monday in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Students bundled in coats shuffled between lectures. Professors sipped coffee behind thick-paned office windows. But as the sun rose over the icy Charles River, it cast light on something unthinkable, something the Ivy League had never seen before. 23-year-old Jane Britton, an accomplished graduate student in anthropology, was found dead in her apartment just a stone's throw from Harvard's prestigious Peabody Museum. Murdered in the dead of night, bludgeoned, her body covered in red ochre, a powder associated with ancient burial rituals. It was horrifying, it was bizarre, and it didn't fit the picture-perfect image of Harvard at all. But Jane Britton was not just any student. She was brilliant, outspoken, known for her wit, her curiosity, and her relentless drive to uncover the mysteries of human civilization. Now she had become one. Who could have done this? A jealous academic rival? A deranged stranger? Or someone inside the very institution she trusted? As the media frenzy erupted and police swarmed the campus, Harvard closed ranks. The administration offered little. Professors clammed up. Students whispered in hallways. A veil of silence descended over Cambridge. And so, the mystery began. A case that would baffle police, enrage the public, and haunt Harvard for decades. This is the story of Jane Britton, the girl who uncovered secrets of the past until she became one. January 7th, 1969. The chill of winter-blanketed Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the Harvard campus pulsed with the quiet urgency of students returning from the holiday break. But for one student, Jane Britton, the new year would never begin. She didn't show up for her scheduled exam. That wasn't like Jane. Not at all. She was punctual, dependable, the kind of student who treated academic commitments like gospel. Her boyfriend, James Humphreys, was the first to notice something was wrong. They had spoken the night before, had dinner together, even discussed her upcoming exams. Jane was cheerful, engaged. There was no indication of anything being off. But now it was almost noon. Jane hadn't turned up. She hadn't called. And she wasn't answering her phone. Humphreys grew concerned. He made his way to her apartment, a 4th-floor walk-up at 6 University Road, just outside Harvard Yard, nestled in the heart of Harvard Square. A building filled with graduate students and young professionals. A place where you were supposed to feel safe. The door was locked. Strange. He knocked. No answer. That's when he called for help from Jane's neighbors, including a fellow Harvard student named Donald Mitchell, and eventually the building's superintendent. They unlocked the door, and what they found inside would send shockwaves across the city. The scene was surreal. Jane Britton was lying face up on her bed, wearing a nightgown. Her body was partially covered with a fur coat and a rug. Her legs hung off the edge of the mattress, dangling limply toward the floor. Blood spattered across the sheets, soaked into the pillow. It was clear, immediately horrifyingly, that Jane was dead. Someone had murdered her, brutally. The killer had struck her multiple times in the head with a blunt object. The autopsy would later reveal that the cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma injuries to the skull. It wasn't quick. It wasn't merciful. It was rage. Panic swept through the apartment. The neighbors backed away. The room, now eerily quiet, felt like a crime scene frozen in time. And yet, there were signs that suggested something even more chilling. This wasn't just a random act of violence. The arrangement of the body, the objects placed around her, the fur coat draped with almost ritualistic precision. There was speculation, whispered among students and later printed in headlines, that it might have been part of an ancient Mesopotamian burial ritual, a nod to Jane's field of study. But was that true? Or was it a gruesome coincidence? Police arrived at the scene. So did Harvard officials. And the media? They swarmed. Jane wasn't just any student. She was brilliant, prominent, the daughter of a Harvard-associated anthropologist. This was a headline that wrote itself. Harvard co-ed slain in ritualistic killing. The room bore no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No splintered locks. It was as if Jane had known her killer or trusted them enough to let them in. Her purse was missing. Her underwear had been taken. There were faint signs of sexual assault, but tests in 1969 were limited. The medical examiner could not conclusively determine if she had been raped. But the implication was there. The fear, the horror. Detectives scrambled to piece together her final moments. What time had she come home? Had anyone seen her that night? Witnesses confirmed. Jane had been out with Humphreys until about 8:30 p.m. They had dinner, went ice skating. They parted ways, and she walked back to her apartment. She was seen around 8:45 p.m. by a neighbor. That was the last time anyone saw Jane Britton alive. Her apartment was secured, evidence collected, but the scene was frustratingly clean. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no weapon found. And then the whispers began. Jane had confided in friends about a strange man, someone who had followed her once, someone who watched her window from the street below. She had mentioned a creeping sense of being surveilled, stalked. Had he come back? Police canvassed the area, talked to students, to faculty, to friends, but no suspect emerged. There were rumors fueled by campus gossip and media frenzy. Some believed it was a jealous lover, others a deranged professor, and then there were those who insisted it was someone from Jane's archaeology circle, someone who wanted her silenced. Investigators found traces of red ochre in the apartment, an earthy pigment used in ancient burials, including those Jane had studied. But was it symbolic, or just academic residue? The press ran wild with theories. Harvard students slain in Mesopotamian rite. Ancient rituals haunt modern campus. The story was everywhere. But answers? Those were in short supply. Days turned into weeks. The semester moved on. But Jane's memory hung over the university like a ghost. Her professors were shaken. Her classmates traumatized. A security panic surged across Harvard Yard. Curfews were enacted. Locks were reinforced. Students whispered warnings in dorm halls. Don't walk alone. Don't open your door to strangers. Remember Jane. She had been on the brink of brilliance. A rising star. A gifted archaeologist, fluent in ancient languages, with a sharp mind and a warm smile. Her death wasn't just tragic. It was senseless. But perhaps the most haunting detail? Jane Britton was killed in a place she should have been safest. Her own bed, in a building full of neighbors, friends, and academics. In the heart of Harvard, with the world ahead of her. And yet, the deeper police dug, the darker the shadows became. Because in Cambridge, where intellect reigned and secrets slept beneath ivy-covered walls, Jane's murder wasn't just a crime. It was a riddle, one that would remain unsolved for nearly 50 years. The death of Jane Britton did more than just end a life. It cracked the very foundation of Harvard University, an institution steeped in tradition, cloaked in prestige, and now trembling beneath the weight of fear. The halls of academia, once bustling with optimism and intellectual curiosity, were now stalked by silence and suspicion. Students no longer walked freely through Harvard Yard at night. They huddled in groups. They double-locked their doors. Conversations shifted from research and exams to murder, fear, and the haunting question echoing through every dormitory. Who killed Jane Britton? This wasn't supposed to happen here. Harvard, one of the most respected and secure universities in the country, had a reputation to uphold. A murder on campus? That was a threat not just to student safety, but to the very brand of the Ivy League. And so, the university's response was swift, but calculated. They increased security, hired additional campus patrols, announced changes to student housing. But behind the scenes, whispers circulated that something was being buried, something deeper than a body. A scandal, a failure, a cover-up? The Cambridge police, led by Detective Joseph McLaughlin, were in over their heads. This wasn't an alleyway homicide. This was the elite inner circle of Harvard academia. The victim wasn't a nameless stranger. She was Jane Britton, well-known, connected, and beloved. The press swarmed the investigation, turning Harvard Square into a media circus. Headlines screamed across Boston and New York. Harvard co-ed slain in ritual killing. Murder in the Ivory Tower. Who is the Harvard killer? Reporters camped outside Jane's building. They hounded classmates, professors, even her grieving parents. The story had everything the media craved: beauty, brains, blood, and a mystery too tangled to ignore. Inside the university, the archaeology department, a once respected enclave of ancient studies, was now a vortex of suspicion. Faculty meetings turned cold. Trust eroded. Colleagues looked over their shoulders, wondering if the killer sat beside them in lectures or faculty lounges. It didn't help that Jane had been working closely with some of the most influential minds in the field. Scholars like Dr. C.C. Lambert-Karlofsky and Dr. Stephen Williams, men whose reputations spanned continents. Men who were suddenly being scrutinized not for their research, but for their whereabouts. Still, police had nothing. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, no concrete suspect, and no motive that made any sense. Was it personal? Professional? Sexual? Was it jealousy? Rage? Or something far more sinister? Detectives combed through Jane's academic life. Every thesis draft, every note, every personal journal. They questioned her classmates, her roommates, her ex-boyfriends. They built timelines, dredged up grudges. Even the most minor disagreements became potential motives. Then came a strange twist, one that turned rumor into paranoia. In the weeks before her death, Jane had allegedly told friends about a man watching her, lurking. She believed someone was outside her window, night after night, just staring. She wasn't paranoid. She told them he was real. She felt watched, stalked. The police took it seriously, but no one could identify the man. No one ever saw him. There were no footprints in the snow, no strange visitors to the building. The stalker theory became just another dead end. Until they found the fire escape, investigators discovered that Jane's killer had likely entered her apartment through the fire escape outside her bedroom window. The window had been slightly ajar. No sign of forced entry. But here's what made it chilling. Someone had come up that escape route before. In the weeks prior, Jane had reportedly heard footsteps outside her window on the metal stairs. But she thought it was just a neighbor. Maybe a cat. Now, that sound had a face. A murderer's face. Someone had scaled 4 stories in the dead of night, slipped through the window, and murdered her just feet away from where the rest of the building slept. The message was clear: no one was safe. Harvard tried to calm the storm. They issued statements, promised cooperation with law enforcement. But the truth was obvious. There was a predator loose, and no one had answers. Female students were terrified. Some dropped out. Some transferred. Parents flooded the administration with letters demanding protection for their daughters. Police patrols doubled. Locks were reinforced. Window alarms were installed. But the damage was done. Cambridge, once a city of scholars, now bore the scars of fear. And in the center of it all was Jane Britton. She had been murdered in her own bed, in a building full of students, and no one had seen or heard a thing. The crime scene was quiet, too quiet. Jane's body had been deliberately posed. Her legs dangled off the bed. Her nightgown was bloodied. A fur coat lay across her chest, almost reverently, and then the rug wrapped around her like a shroud. It was eerie, chilling, intentional. Police didn't know what to make of it. Was the killer toying with them? Sending a message? Or was this part of some ancient ritual? That's when the red ochre was discovered. Powdered pigment often used in prehistoric burial sites, including ones Jane had studied extensively. Reporters seized the narrative. Murder imitates ancient ritual. Archaeologists slain in own research. But experts push back. There was no clear indication the killer knew anything about Mesopotamian burial practices. And the ochre? It could have simply been dust from one of Jane's dig kits. A coincidence. Nothing more. Still, the media didn't care. And neither did the public. The story had grown legs. And now it had its own mythology. Jane's murder became more than just a homicide. It became folklore. A modern Gothic tale whispered through ivy-covered walls. A ghost story passed down from generation to generation of Harvard students. But the detectives? They were out of leads. They questioned dozens of people, polygraphed friends, analyzed hair samples, consulted forensic experts. But again and again they hit walls. The killer had left no prints, no usable DNA, nothing to tie them to the scene. And with every day that passed, Jane's case grew colder. The university returned to business as usual. Class schedules resumed. Exams were held. Lectures continued. But the shadows lingered. A plaque honoring Jane's academic contributions was placed in the anthropology building. Her thesis, unfinished, was awarded posthumously. But behind every tribute was an unanswered question. Why? Why Jane? Why that night? Why that brutality? And most of all, why did the killer never strike again? Was it a crime of passion? A one-time eruption? Or had the murderer simply disappeared? The students never forgot. Even decades later, Jane's story would be retold to every incoming class. A cautionary tale, a mystery that became part of Harvard's unofficial history. But what no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that the killer's identity had been hiding in plain sight for decades, unseen, unmatched, unpunished, until technology finally caught up to evil. Winter crept back into Cambridge. Snow settled where fear once prowled. But the killer remained a ghost. Weeks passed, then months, then years. And in the chilling silence that followed Jane Britton's murder, something even more terrifying began to set in, forgetting. The headlines faded. Reporters moved on. Other tragedies took center stage. What was once a media frenzy became yesterday's story. The buzz that filled the Harvard halls in January of 1969 dissolved into whispered speculation, then bitter silence. But for the people who knew her, for her family, her friends, and a handful of investigators, the nightmare never ended. Jane was gone, and no one had been held accountable. The case files ballooned. Evidence was boxed and stored. Suspects came and went. Dozens were questioned. A handful were polygraphed. Some even confessed to things they didn't do. But none of it stuck. None of it made sense. Police retraced Jane's steps over and over again, trying to fill in the blanks. The night before she died, she'd been out with her boyfriend, James Humphreys, a fellow anthropology student. They'd gone ice skating, had dinner, and parted ways around 8:30 p.m. By 10:30, Jane was back in her apartment. By 1:30 a.m., she was dead. A 4-hour window. That was all they had. And yet it led nowhere. The fire escape theory, promising at first, also hit a dead end. Yes, someone had likely entered through her window, but the metal showed no fingerprints, no signs of struggle, no DNA. And this was before modern forensics, before touch DNA, before crime scenes were preserved like sacred temples. Back then, they vacuumed the floor, tossed out bags of evidence, let officers stomp through crime scenes with muddy boots. They didn't know what they were losing, and by the time they did, it was already gone. The investigators kept looking, kept asking, but the trail grew colder every year. Jane's ex-boyfriends were cleared. Her professors had airtight alibis. Even James Humphreys, the boyfriend she'd kissed goodnight, just hours before she was killed, passed multiple polygraphs. There was no forced entry, no signs of sexual assault, no stolen property, only a brutal blow to the head and a strange theatrical crime scene. Her killer had used a blunt object, possibly a rock or a brick. Jane had died from massive cranial trauma, but the autopsy revealed something else. She had been surprised. There were no defensive wounds, no signs she tried to fight back. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She was either asleep when the killer struck or she knew them. And that detail haunted everyone involved in the case. Because if Jane knew her killer, then it had to be someone close, a classmate, a friend, someone who could walk into her bedroom in the middle of the night and she wouldn't feel afraid. But that theory, too, collapsed under the weight of time. With no evidence and no leads, police did what many departments eventually do when the answers won't come. They boxed it up, filed it away, and waited. Jane's parents never stopped asking questions. George and Ruth Britton turned their grief into a crusade. For years, they lobbied law enforcement, wrote letters, met with reporters, pushed for updates, but they grew older, and the answers never came. Eventually, the letters stopped. The meetings ended. Time, relentless and cruel, swept over them like snow on a forgotten sidewalk. George died in 2000. Ruth followed in 2006. They never learned who took their daughter's life. And Harvard? Harvard moved on. The students graduated. Professors retired. Buildings were renovated. Jane's name faded from course catalogs and department rosters. By the 1990s, her murder had become a whisper, a chilling anecdote for freshmen on campus tours, a name spoken late at night with the dorm room lights turned off. You know someone was murdered in this building, right? Yet, underneath all that forgetting, the case waited, unsolved, dormant, but not dead. In 2007, nearly 40 years after Jane was murdered, something unexpected happened. A Boston Globe reporter, Dugan Arnett, picked up the cold trail. Curious about the forgotten killing, he filed a Freedom of Information request to access the case file. A formality, he thought, routine. But what came back was a wall of silence. The request was denied. Cambridge police claimed that the case was still active. Active? After 4 decades? That didn't sit right. Arnett kept digging. His story ran in 2007, and it reignited interest in the case. Suddenly, former students, professors, and even investigators started talking again. But still no answers. Narrator intensifying hopeful tone. It wasn't until 2017, almost 50 years after Jane's death, that her surviving family members demanded a new review. And this time, science was on their side, because the world had changed. And now, so had forensics. DNA technology, once the stuff of science fiction, was now standard. Cases from the 60s, 70s, even earlier were being solved across the country using tiny biological traces and genetic genealogy. If anything from Jane's crime scene had been preserved, there might be hope. And to everyone's surprise, something had been preserved. A small sample, a smear of biological material on Jane's clothing, untested for decades, forgotten in a storage vault. In 2018, nearly 50 years after the murder, that sample was sent to a lab. And then, they found a match. Narrator, sharp shift, dramatic reveal tone. The man's name was Michael Sumter. He wasn't a professor. He wasn't a classmate. He wasn't part of Jane's life at all. In fact, Jane had likely never even met him, because Michael Sumter wasn't from Harvard. He was a career criminal, a violent predator with a known history of assault and rape in the Boston area. And at the time of Jane Britton's murder, he lived just blocks away. Michael Sumter had already been convicted of multiple rapes in the 1970s. He had spent years in prison. He was considered so dangerous that he was constantly transferred between facilities to prevent escape. But here's the catch. He died in 2001, 16 years before police would link his DNA to the crime scene. Jane's killer had walked free for 32 years. And then he died before justice could ever be served. For the Britton family, it was a bittersweet ending. They finally had a name, a face, an answer, but no apology, no trial, no chance to confront the man who shattered their world. Michael Sumter had escaped justice, not in court, but in death. And yet, the truth mattered. For decades, people whispered about professors, accused boyfriends, suspected insiders. But in the end, it wasn't an Ivy League conspiracy. It wasn't a jealous lover. It was a stranger, an opportunist, a killer who slipped through an unlocked window and disappeared into the night. Narrator reflective, slower pacing. The revelation also forced law enforcement to rethink other cases. If Michael Sumter had killed Jane in 1969, what else had he done? How many others were never linked to his name? How many families were still waiting, still wondering, just like the Brittons? And how many Jane Brittons were out there, still unsolved? The case of Jane Britton remained open for nearly 50 years. But it wasn't just about the murder. It was about the silence that followed, the years of uncertainty, the fear, the gossip, the lies, and the truth that arrived too late. But even in death, Jane's story lived on. Because she wasn't just another victim. She was a scholar, a daughter, a dreamer, and finally she was remembered. The case had a name. The killer had a face. The truth had finally surfaced. But underneath that long-awaited resolution, a darker question lingered. Why did it take so long? Why did a brilliant young woman's murder, one that happened in the heart of Harvard, one that shocked the nation, go unsolved for nearly 50 years? The answer? Lies, fear, and silence. Because the story of Jane Britton isn't just about a murder. It's about what happens when secrets become survival and institutions protect themselves instead of the people within them. And as investigators began to revisit the decades-old crime with fresh eyes, they realized something terrifying. Harvard might have known more than it ever let on. Cut to 1969. In the wake of Jane's murder, Harvard scrambled to control the fallout. Administrators issued brief, carefully worded statements. They offered condolences to Jane's family, counseling to shaken students, security upgrades to reassure the community. But behind closed doors, they were panicking. A female graduate student had just been murdered. In her apartment, a stone's throw from Harvard Yard. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a PR nightmare. Harvard's reputation was at stake. And in the Ivy League, image is everything. According to former faculty members, students, and even law enforcement, the university clamped down hard. They discouraged speculation, discouraged interviews, discouraged questions. Whispers began to circulate through the anthropology department. Had Jane known too much? Had she angered someone? Had she uncovered something in her research? To the public, it sounded like paranoia, urban legend, the stuff of conspiracy theories. But to those on the inside, especially women in the department, it didn't feel far-fetched. Because long before the word feminism found traction on campus, women like Jane Britton were already fighting quiet battles behind the scenes. For recognition, for safety, for survival. In 1969, the anthropology department at Harvard was a fortress of tradition. Male-dominated, secretive, powerful. Female students often found themselves isolated, marginalized. Some even claimed they were openly discouraged from pursuing fieldwork, especially in remote or dangerous regions. Jane, however, pushed back. She wasn't just smart, she was fearless. She planned to do her dissertation research in Iran. She was already fluent in French. She could read Middle Persian. She climbed mountains, rode horses, lived for the unknown. And that boldness didn't always sit well with her professors. One faculty member, speaking anonymously years later, admitted that Jane was respected, but not protected. She'd made waves in a place where waves weren't welcome. She stood out too much, and that fact lingered uncomfortably in the background of her case for decades. Because while police searched for a faceless intruder, some wondered if the danger had always been closer. There was also the matter of the crime scene. Jane's apartment had been the epicenter of the investigation. but the way it was handled raised serious questions. Her body had been discovered around 12:30 p.m., but by 2 p.m., multiple faculty members had already entered the apartment. Why? Who let them in? And what were they looking for? Some sources claimed they were identifying artifacts Jane had been working on. Others said they were there for emotional support. But skeptics argued something more sinister, that evidence might have been removed, that information might have been scrubbed, that someone didn't want certain things seen or known. And when you look at the facts, it's hard to dismiss those theories outright. One of Jane's professors, Karl Lambert-Karlofsky, had been an early person of interest, not because there was evidence of guilt, but because of proximity and a complicated dynamic. He was brilliant, respected, and known to be intense. He was also one of the first people to arrive at the crime scene. Years later, Lambert-Karlofsky would express bitterness about the cloud of suspicion that hovered over him for decades. But the fact that any professor had access to an active crime scene is shocking. Why were boundaries crossed? Why weren't protocols followed? And who was protecting whom? Because if this had happened at any other college, it might have been different. But this wasn't any college. It was Harvard. And Harvard doesn't air its dirty laundry. Jane's case also highlights a broader problem: how elite institutions deal with internal scandal. When something dark happens behind closed, ivy-covered walls, the reflex is almost always the same. Contain, control, protect the brand. Police departments, too, sometimes fall into this trap, especially when dealing with high-profile entities. The Cambridge police had jurisdiction over the case, but sources say they were cooperative with the university from the start. Some even claim there was pressure to avoid implicating anyone connected to the school. No bad press, no scandal, no truth. So while Jane's friends grieved, while her family begged for answers, while the public moved on, the walls around her murder grew higher and thicker. Even when DNA evidence emerged decades later, Cambridge police were reluctant to name suspects until the lab results were ironclad. They knew what was at stake. Because what if, after all these years, the killer turned out to be someone with a Harvard tie? A professor? A student? A secret? That shadow lingered over the case for half a century. And through it all, Jane Britton's legacy became something different. Not just a symbol of violence, but a symbol of erasure, of how powerful systems forget the people they fail to protect, of how smart, capable women can be silenced not just by force, but by bureaucracy. But Jane didn't vanish. She didn't disappear into the footnotes of history. She remained, in stories, in suspicion, in the quiet activism of those who whispered her name long after others forgot it. Even the strange details of her murder felt symbolic. The red ochre sprinkled around her body, a ritualistic gesture seen in ancient burial rites. Was it staged? Was it real? Was her killer sending a message? To her? To Harvard? To all of us? We may never know. Because while we now have a name, Michael Sumter, we don't have his words. He never spoke about Jane, never confessed, never explained why. He died in 2001, taking his motives to the grave. And that's the cruelty of justice that arrives too late. You can identify the killer, but you can't confront them. You can solve the mystery, but you can't undo the silence. You can close the file, but you can't close the wound. The shadows that followed Jane Britton weren't just cast by her killer. They were cast by a system that didn't listen fast enough, didn't act boldly enough, didn't care loud enough. And while her story is no longer cold, it still burns with unanswered questions about power, about privilege, about what gets buried and what refuses to stay hidden. Because sometimes the darkest part of a crime isn't the murder, it's the silence that follows. Time is supposed to dull the edges of pain, blur the outlines of tragedy. But for Jane Britton, time did something different. It sharpened the mystery. It amplified the silence. And it left behind an echo, one that haunted every hallway, every whisper, every dusty box of unsolved files that sat in the archives of Cambridge Police and Harvard University. Because as the decades passed, one question refused to fade. How does a murder like Jane's go unanswered for so long? And when the answer finally came, it wasn't through confession or a tip or a moment of remorse. It came from the past itself, DNA evidence, like a ghost reaching up from the grave to whisper, "I was always here." It had been nearly 48 years. Jane's parents had long since passed. Her friends had moved on, carrying their grief like a scar buried beneath everyday life. The case had become the stuff of local lore, whispers of an Ivy League murder, a promising student silenced, a killer never caught. But in 2017, the cold case unit of the Middlesex District Attorney's Office decided to take a fresh look. Not out of a tip, not because of new leads, but because of technology. You see, in 1969, the science of forensics was primitive. There were no DNA profiles, no Cody's database, no rapid sequencing. But now, a single hair, a drop of blood, the faintest trace of skin cells could unlock the truth. Investigators pulled the old evidence out of storage, and what they found shocked them. The integrity of the sample was intact. There was still usable DNA, a miracle. And when that sample was run through the National DNA Database, it hit. The match? Michael Sumter, a name no one in Jane's orbit recognized, a name that had never surfaced in the original investigation, but one that had a chilling past, because Michael Sumter was no stranger to violence. Born in 1947, Michael Sumter grew up in Boston. On the surface, he was just another face in the crowd, working odd jobs, living in public housing, in and out of trouble. But beneath that exterior was a predator. Between 1975 and 1978, he raped and terrorized multiple women across the greater Boston area. He had a specific pattern. He targeted women who lived alone. He forced his way in. He struck them, raped them, then vanished. Cold, calculated, cruel. He was finally caught in 1975 and convicted of multiple assaults. But Jane's murder? That was 6 years earlier. And back in 1969, no one had even heard of him. He wasn't on the police radar. He had no known ties to Harvard. But the DNA didn't lie. Not only did Sumter's DNA match the sample taken from Jane's body, it also matched DNA in 2 other unsolved sexual assault cases from the same era. Suddenly, a terrifying pattern emerged. Michael Sumter was a serial predator, a man who slipped through the cracks, and Jane Britton, brilliant, curious, unsuspecting, had been one of his earliest victims. But here's where the story gets even darker. Michael Sumter died in 2001 from cancer. He was never interviewed, never charged in Jane's case, never forced to explain why. The closest anyone came to answers was through his widow. When contacted by investigators in 2018, she admitted something chilling, that Sumter had once lived near Harvard Square, just a 15-minute walk from Jane's apartment, that he was familiar with the area, and that he had confessed to bad things in his past, things he refused to elaborate on. She didn't know about Jane. She didn't know about the others, but the pieces were there. The predator, the proximity, the silence. Now, with Sumter identified, investigators began re-examining the case from a new angle. Jane wasn't killed by someone she knew. She wasn't the victim of academic jealousy or archaeological secrets or internal vendettas. She was killed by a stranger, a man who slipped in through her window, who used the darkness as his shield, who took what he wanted, and left her lifeless on the floor of her apartment. And for almost 50 years, he remained invisible. Because he didn't fit the profile. Because he wasn't from her world. Because sometimes we look so hard for a complex motive, we miss the simple, brutal truth. She was alone. He was hunting. And no one saw it coming. On November 19th, 2018, the Middlesex District Attorney's Office held a press conference. They made the announcement the world had been waiting nearly half a century to hear. Jane Britton's case had been solved. They named Michael Sumter as the killer. They thanked the advances in DNA technology. They acknowledged the pain endured by Jane's family. And then silence. No perp walk. No court hearing. No final confrontation. Because her killer was already in the ground. Narrator quietly haunting. There would be no apologies, No explanations, no remorse, just the hollow sound of truth arriving too late to matter. But for Jane's surviving loved ones, the resolution still meant something. Her brother, Boyd Britton, issued a heartfelt statement. He thanked the investigators. He expressed sadness that his parents never got to see the case solved. And he ended with words that captured the weight of it all. While the pain of Jane's death never goes away, the confirmation of the identity of her killer is a significant step toward closure. Closure, a word that sounds comforting, but in truth it's complicated. Because what does closure mean when the killer is already dead? What does justice mean when it takes half a century? And what do we owe the victims of forgotten crimes? Beyond just answers, we owe them truth. We owe them visibility. And we owe them the kind of relentless pursuit that never lets their stories slip into silence. After the press conference, Harvard University issued a brief statement acknowledging the case's resolution and expressing sympathy for the Britton family. But many wondered, was that enough? For decades, the university had been the backdrop of this crime, and some argued an obstacle in its investigation. Had Harvard's obsession with image played a role in burying Jane's truth? Had the culture of secrecy allowed suspicion to cloud innocent lives while the real killer walked free? And had Jane been forgotten, not just as a victim, but as a person, a scholar, a friend, a woman whose future was stolen? Jane Britton was more than a name in a cold case file. She was brilliant, adventurous, fearless. She stood on the edge of something extraordinary, and in a single, brutal moment she was erased. But now, after 50 years, her story no longer ends with a question mark. It ends with a name, a truth, a reckoning. And maybe in that truth, we can begin to honor the echo she left behind, the echo of a life that deserved more time, more justice, and above all, more than silence. There's something cruel about silence. It doesn't scream. It doesn't weep. It simply waits. It waited in the shadows of room 19 at 6 University Road. It lingered in the archives of Harvard's administration. It cloaked the files in the Middlesex County DA's office. For nearly half a century, silence was the most persistent character in the story of Jane Britton. And now that the killer had a name, Michael Sumter, that silence, it didn't disappear. It changed shape. After the DA's 2018 press conference, the public had what it wanted. A name, a match, a resolution. But for many, it wasn't enough. Because the question remained. How did this take so long? The DNA was there. The evidence was stored. The technology existed by the early 2000s. And yet, nothing happened until 2017. Why? The deeper you dig, the more disturbing the answers become. Let's talk about Harvard, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, home to presidents, Nobel laureates, billionaires, and also the scene of a brutal, unsolved murder. In the days following Jane's death, Harvard officials were tight-lipped. They released minimal statements. They discouraged public speculation. And they strongly resisted any suggestion that the university could have done more. But many believe Harvard's actions went far beyond standard protocol. They believe Harvard helped bury the truth. Here's what we know. In 1969, just days after the murder, police began investigating people close to Jane, her boyfriend, classmates, professors. But whispers began circulating that Harvard administration pressured police to keep the investigation quiet. The concern wasn't safety. It wasn't justice. It was reputation. A murder on Harvard's watch? That wasn't just a tragedy. It was a public relations nightmare. And for a university that thrives on prestige, image is everything. There was no campus-wide warning, no safety overhaul, no admission that a serial predator could be operating near the student body. Instead, Harvard's stance was simple. Let the police handle it. Let the media lose interest. And above all, let it fade. And fade it did. For years, Jane Britton's case was a footnote, an unsolved tragedy lost in a sea of ivy-covered walls and academic laurels, even as DNA evidence revolutionized criminal justice, even as cold cases across the country were solved by the hundreds, Jane's case collected dust. So again, why? In 2005, investigative journalist and Harvard graduate Becky Cooper stumbled across Jane's story. She was working on a different project when someone told her, there was a student murdered in the 60s. The professor did it. And Harvard covered it up. That whisper lit a fire. Cooper began digging, interviewing former classmates, reading microfilm, accessing archived police reports. Her investigation would ultimately take years and become a basis for her critically acclaimed book, We Keep the Dead Close. Cooper discovered what many had long suspected, that the silence around Jane's murder wasn't just inertia. It was intentional. There were files Jane's family was never allowed to see, notes from early investigators that were lost. Access to Harvard administrators? Blocked. Even Jane's own academic records were sealed. It was as if Jane had been scrubbed from Harvard's narrative. A stain they were too proud to admit. A ghost they refused to acknowledge. And yet, the irony is hard to ignore. Jane Britton wasn't just a student. She loved Harvard. She was passionate about anthropology. She was immersed in the culture, the academia, the ambition. She was the daughter of an Ivy League legacy. Her father, the vice president of Radcliffe. Her mother, a socialite entrenched in Boston's elite. Jane wasn't an outsider. She was the embodiment of Harvard's ideal. And still she was discarded, left to become a ghost in the corridors of privilege. And then there's the killer Michael Sumter, a man whose crimes stretched from Cambridge to Boston. A man who was arrested 6 years after Jane's murder for a string of assaults. A man whose DNA was in the system by 2001. And yet, it took another 16 years before anyone matched him to Jane. That's not just delay. That's failure. There's a name for this kind of neglect. Institutional inertia. When systems prioritize process over people. When bureaucracy overshadows basic human urgency. When the gears of justice turn so slowly, they stop moving altogether. Michael Sumter was in the system. The evidence was in storage. The technology was available. So, why wasn't the connection made sooner? Because no one was looking. Because a young woman's murder, however brutal, wasn't seen as pressing anymore. Because once a story fades from headlines, it slips from memory. And memory is where justice either dies or begins. For Jane's surviving family, the delay was devastating. Her brother, Boyd Britton, had spent decades hoping for closure. He wrote, in 2018, "We are relieved to know who killed our sister. But it's hard not to feel bitter that it took so long. That bitterness isn't spite. It's sorrow. Sorrow that their parents went to their graves never knowing the truth. Sorrow that Jane's name was used in rumors, but not remembered in honor. Sorrow that the institutions meant to protect her, police, Harvard, the courts, let her down. So, what is Jane Britton's legacy? She was a scholar, a dreamer, a woman with her whole life ahead of her. But more than that, she is a symbol of how easily women's stories are lost, how institutions bury truth in the name of image, how silence isn't passive, it's active, and how sometimes it takes decades to hear the full story. Jane's murder may be solved, but the cost of silence remains. It cost her justice. It cost her family peace. It cost an entire academic community the chance to confront its own failures. But now her story is being told, loudly, clearly, unapologetically, in books, in documentaries, in this very video, and in every telling. We remember not just the tragedy, but the truth, because silence only wins when we stop listening. And Jane Britton, she deserves to be heard. Fade out. Somber piano music plays. Overlay text. In memory of Jane Britton, 1945 to 1969. May her voice never fade again. The title sounds like a whisper from the grave. We keep the dead close. Not just a book, not just a phrase, but a warning and a promise. Because sometimes the dead don't rest. Not when their story remains untold. Not when their justice is delayed. Not when their memory is reduced to rumor and myth. This is the final chapter of Jane Britton's story. and the beginning of something more powerful than closure, reckoning. Becky Cooper didn't know Jane Britton. They were separated by generations, by time, by tragedy, but in many ways, their worlds mirrored each other. Both were women at Harvard. Both chased knowledge with relentless intensity, and both encountered the quiet, disorienting power of being silenced. When Cooper first heard Jane's name, it was wrapped in scandal. She had an affair with a professor. He murdered her. Harvard covered it up. It was the kind of campus lore whispered late, at night, half rumor, half warning, a ghost story. But as Cooper dug deeper, she realized this wasn't just an unsolved murder. It was an institution's buried guilt, a woman's erased potential, and a society's failure to value women's lives unless they're already gone. We Keep the Dead Close became a literary excavation, a journey through old police files, dusty archives, and fading memories. It wasn't about proving conspiracy. It was about confronting silence. Cooper spent nearly a decade on her investigation. She read Jane's letters, interviewed her friends, searched the corridors of Harvard anthropology for the truth, and with every page, every clue, every whisper, Jane Britton became more than a victim. She became a mirror, reflecting how institutions twist narratives to preserve power, how women's voices are minimized, questioned, doubted, and how truth often dies in plain sight. In Jane's own journals, a vibrant, fiercely intelligent woman emerges. She was witty, curious, ambitious, slightly chaotic in the way brilliant minds often are. She wrestled with loneliness, felt the weight of perfectionism, wanted love, but not at the cost of her independence. She spoke fluent French, had traveled the world, planned to excavate ancient sites and rewrite history through anthropology. Instead, she became history. Her words, once private, now echo in Cooper's book, Fragments of a Life Stopped Too Soon. There's something romantic about ancient things, Jane once wrote. They last. They keep their secrets. How bitterly prophetic. And what of the secrets? What was Harvard hiding? Did they really suppress information? Did a professor kill Jane and get away with it? Cooper chased that theory for years. All signs pointed to one man, Dr. Lambert Karlofsky, Jane's professor. The rumors about them were pervasive. Some said they had an affair. Others believed he was obsessed. He was even interviewed by police in 1969, but he denied everything. No affair, no obsession, no involvement, and the evidence backed him up. Decades later, DNA would prove he wasn't the killer. But by then, the damage was done. His name had lived in the shadows of suspicion for nearly 50 years. And Jane? She had become a myth trapped in the narrative others built around her. Cooper's book asks the deeper question. Why are we so quick to believe the scandal? Why do we assume the woman slept her way into danger? Why do we instinctively cast suspicion on the intimate rather than the random? Because scandal sells. Because mystery intrigues. Because when a woman dies violently, the world asks, what did she do to deserve it? Jane didn't deserve it. She was in her apartment. She had locked the door. She had done everything right. And still someone got in. Someone murdered her. Someone left her body covered in blood and sprinkled with red ochre. An ancient burial rite Jane herself had studied. Was it symbolic? Was it personal? Or just the killer mocking the world she loved? To this day, no one knows. But that single detail, the red ochre, became a metaphor for Jane's legacy. She was buried in myth, entombed in speculation, and finally unearthed by someone who cared enough to ask why. We keep the dead close. It's what we do as humans. We name buildings after them. We preserve their letters. We chase justice in cold cases, even decades later. But keeping the dead close isn't just about remembering them. It's about learning from them, understanding how and why we failed them. In Jane's case, that failure was systemic. The police were under-equipped. Harvard was silent. The media was distracted. And a killer vanished into the crowd, only to reoffend again and again. Justice didn't arrive until 2018. By then, Jane's mother and father were gone. So were most of the original investigators. The cost of delay was steep and irreversible. But here's the part that matters most. Jane Britton is no longer just a victim. She's no longer a cautionary tale. She is a catalyst. Her case helped expose Harvard's culture of silence. It sparked conversations about how elite institutions protect themselves. It brought attention to cold case DNA technology, and through Cooper's book, Jane now speaks again. Her voice is in bookstores, podcasts, documentaries. This very video, she's not a mystery anymore. She's a memory with a name, a story, and a reckoning. There's something poetic about the way this story ends. Becky Cooper began her journey with a rumor. She ended it with a revolution. She didn't just write a book. She resurrected a woman. She gave voice to silence. And in doing so, she reminded the world. Truth matters, even when it's buried. Justice matters, even when it's late. And women's lives matter, even when institutions try to erase them. So yes, we do keep the dead close. Not because we're haunted, but because we owe them. We owe them our time, our questions, our fury, our truth. Jane Britton's death is no longer a secret, but her life, it's finally being honored. And as long as we tell her story, as long as we speak her name, she will never truly be gone. They said it was a cold case. They said it was forgotten. They said the truth would never surface. But time has a way of bending back, and stories, real stories, didn't stay buried forever. Jane Britton was more than a mystery. She was a daughter, a scholar, a force. And now, decades later, the silence has been broken. But her case is a chilling reminder that even in the most prestigious places, even surrounded by knowledge, power, and privilege, justice can be ignored, and danger can walk freely. If this is how one case was hidden for 50 years, how many more are still buried? Here, on Unsolved Crime Stories, we dig deeper. We bring the voices of the silence back to life. We expose what others forgot or chose to forget. If Jane's story moved you, if the truth matters to you, then make sure you subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us next time for another case they never wanted you to remember. Because every mystery has a voice. You just have to listen. She stepped off the school bus just a few hundred feet from home. A child carrying books, dreams, and innocence. The sun was still out. Her neighborhood was quiet, safe, familiar. But by nightfall, 9-year-old Angie Houseman had vanished into thin air, and what followed would become one of Missouri's most chilling, heartbreaking mysteries. It was November 18th, 1993, the kind of crisp autumn afternoon when kids laughed their way home from school and leaves crunched beneath hurried feet. In the quiet suburb of St. and Missouri, the day had been uneventful, normal. But for one family, this day would mark the end of everything that ever felt safe. 9-year-old Angie Marie Houseman was a fourth grader at Boer Elementary. Kind-hearted, soft-spoken, and eager to make friends, Angie was the type of child everyone described as sweet to the core. She loved animals, dreamed of being a teacher, and still believed in fairy tales. Her school was just over a mile away, and like most days, she rode the yellow school bus home. Her bus stop wasn't far, just a few hundred yards from her house. A walk she had taken dozens of times before. A walk watched over by neighbors peeking through kitchen windows. A walk so routine, no one ever thought to worry. Until that day, the bus dropped Angie off at around 3 p.m. She walked a short stretch with neighborhood kids, as usual, but they peeled off one by one. And soon, she was alone, less than a block from home. And then, she was gone. No one saw her taken. No one heard her scream. Angie Houseman had simply vanished. At first, her mother and stepfather, Ronald, weren't too concerned. Angie had a habit of lingering to chat with friends. Maybe she stopped to pet a neighbor's dog or wandered off to show someone her drawings. But as the minutes turned to an hour, panic began to set in. They canvassed the route to the bus stop. Neighbors joined in. Children were questioned. Had anyone seen her? Did she say where she was going? Yes, she got off the bus. Yes, she started walking home. But then nothing. The parents, who often watched from their windows, both were busy that day. No one had eyes on Angie. By nightfall, the search expanded. Flashlights cut through darkness. Shouts echoed down quiet streets. Her name, called again and again, received no answer. And then came the call to the police. The officers responded immediately. Angie wasn't the kind of child to run off, and temperatures were dropping quickly. There was no sign she had simply wandered away. And then, something far more disturbing emerged. 10 days earlier, just a few miles away, an 11-year-old girl had been nearly abducted after stepping off her school bus. A man had tried to drag her into the woods, but she fought back and escaped. The predator was still out there, uncaught, unknown. Now the fear was real. Had the same man taken Angie? At this point, I want you to imagine this. You're a parent. Your child is walking home from the bus stop, just yards from safety, and then they're gone. No witness, no evidence, just an eerie silence that swallows up everything you love. That's what Angie's family lived through. And what came next was even darker than anyone could have feared. Stay with me as we uncover the lies, the overlooked suspects, and the long-awaited break in a case that haunted a community for decades. If you believe every child deserves justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true crime stories, and share Angie's story. Her voice was stolen, but you can help make sure it's never forgotten. The morning after Angie disappeared, Saint and awoke, with unease hanging heavy in the air. Police wasted no time. This wasn't a case of a runaway. Angie was only 9. It was cold outside, and she'd vanished from a well-populated area in broad daylight. Something didn't add up. Within hours, they launched an intensive search. K-9 units were brought in. The dogs picked up Angie's scent at the bus stop. It followed the expected route, past hedges, down the sidewalk toward her street. And then halfway to her house, the scent stopped. Just like that. No trail. No struggle. No belongings left behind. The implication was terrifying. Angie hadn't wandered off. She'd been taken. Police scoured the area. Officers searched nearby woods and parks. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead. Divers were sent to search creeks and drains. Neighbors were questioned. Doorbells rang up and down the block. Still nothing. It was as though Angie had evaporated into the air. Then a chilling possibility resurfaced: that attempted abduction 10 days earlier. The girl who survived described a man in a blue sedan. Mid-30s, average build, scruffy beard. He'd grabbed her as she walked home and tried to drag her into the woods. Only her screams and the presence of nearby neighbors forced him to flee. That attacker had never been caught. Could he have returned? One resident reported seeing a blue car cruising slowly through the neighborhood around the time Angie vanished. The driver didn't appear to live there, and his presence didn't feel right. Something about the way he moved, like he was hunting. Investigators created a composite sketch based on this sighting and the earlier assault. They printed thousands of flyers. The image hit TV screens across the state, but no one recognized the man. Tips flooded in, over 300 in the first 24 hours alone. It overwhelmed the department. More than 20 additional officers were reassigned to the case just to handle the leads. But none of them led to Angie. Meanwhile, suspicion began creeping closer to home. Investigators always start with the inner circle: family, neighbors, friends. Angie's stepfather, Ronald, was questioned. He denied any involvement, agreed to a polygraph, opened his home to investigators. He insisted, "I would never hurt her." The polygraph came back inconclusive, but not incriminating. Next, they located Angie's biological father, a man she had never met. He had left the family before she was born. But Angie's mother recalled something disturbing. He had been seen slowly driving past their house multiple times. Just watching. Creepy? Yes. Criminal? Maybe. But he had an alibi. Airtight. And just like that, the leads thinned. The FBI joined the investigation on day 3. With no ransom note, no sightings, and no evidence of Angie running away, federal agents knew one thing: this was an abduction, and time was running out. Each day that passed made the odds of finding Angie alive dwindle. Then, something strange emerged. A teacher came forward. Just days before she vanished, Angie had mentioned a nature trip with her uncle. But her family said she didn't have an uncle. Who was she talking about? Did she trust this person? Was this her abductor? The FBI dug deep. Interviews, background checks, a search through known offenders in the area. But nothing matched. The mysterious uncle vanished into smoke. By now, fear had gripped the community. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Parents waited at bus stops. Windows, once used to casually watch over the neighborhood, now served as barriers tightly closed and locked. Still, no answers came. She was right there, just a few houses away. How does a 9-year-old girl vanish in that final stretch? The truth was coming, but no one was ready for how dark it would be. Stay with me. In the next chapter, the story takes a horrifying turn, a discovery in the woods that changes everything. If you're drawn to uncovering the truth and giving voice to the voiceless, make sure you're subscribed. Angie's story isn't just a case, it's a call to just 9 days. That's how long Angie Houseman was missing. 9 days of fear, of silence, of a city holding its breath. And then, on November 27th, 1993, everything changed. A hunter was walking through the Bush Wildlife Conservation Area, a sprawling 7,000-acre forest preserve about 30 miles west of St. Louis. It was early afternoon, cold and still, the kind of place where you hear every crack of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush. That's when he saw it. At first, it didn't register. His mind tried to deny what he was looking at. But there, tied to a tree, was a small, naked body. The police were called immediately. What they found was almost beyond comprehension. The girl was bound to the tree by handcuffs. Her head was completely wrapped in duct tape, leaving only a small gap around her nose so she could breathe. Her body was covered in bruises, her wrists and ankles torn from days of struggle. And inside her mouth was a piece of her own underwear used as a gag. She had no clothing on. Next to the scene was a plastic bag. Inside, her school notebooks. Her name written on the cover. It was Angie, 9 years old, gone from a quiet street, and now left to die in the woods like garbage. The autopsy delivered a second blow. Angie had not been killed on the day she vanished. She had been held captive for 9 days, starved, tortured, sexually assaulted, and then, sometime just hours before she was found, she was taken into the freezing woods, tied up, and left there alive, to die slowly from hypothermia. She froze to death. The medical examiner said it was likely she had been conscious for hours, maybe longer. That kind of cruelty broke something in the town of St. and people cried in the streets. Grown men couldn't speak. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers waited outside the school, bus stop, silent and seething. Police threw everything they had at the crime scene. Every inch was combed. They found one critical clue, a partial fingerprint on the duct tape wrapped around Angie's head. It wasn't much, but it was something. They ran it through national databases. No match, not even close. Whoever had done this was clean, or careful, or lucky. And then came fear's twin brother, panic. Just 4 days after Angie's body was found, another child vanished. 10-year-old Casey Williamson disappeared from a nearby town just 10 miles away. She had asked her mom if she could visit her friend down the street. She never arrived. Police locked down the region. This time, they weren't waiting. 10 days later, Casey's body was discovered, wrapped in bed sheets, dumped like trash near St. Louis. Her cause of death? Massive blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators immediately feared the worst. Was this a serial killer? Was someone targeting young girls? But the methods were different. Angie had been tied up, tortured, and left to freeze. Casey was killed quickly and dumped. Still, police had no choice but to consider the unthinkable: 2 child murders in the same region, less than 2 weeks apart. Then came a break. Finally, detectives learned that Casey's body had been left in an area with fresh tire tracks. The treads were matched to a specific type of rental pickup truck used by a large car company. They canvassed the neighborhood with a picture of the truck, and they got lucky. A woman remembered seeing that exact vehicle parked outside her neighbor's house the day after Casey disappeared. The house belonged to a woman, her partner, and her brother. When police asked if anyone had rented the truck, they denied it. So, detectives got a warrant. What they found in the basement would chill even the most hardened investigators: traces of Casey's blood and the murder weapon. Eventually, the brother, Thomas Brooks, confessed. He said Casey had knocked on his door looking for his nephews. He lured her inside, took her downstairs, tried to assault her. When she screamed, he hit her. Hard. Then again. He hid her body in the basement for a week, terrified by the ongoing search. When the media frenzy died down, he rented a truck and dumped her remains. Case closed, but Thomas swore he had nothing to do with Angie's murder, and investigators believed him. Too many differences, no evidence, no connections, two predators, two separate nightmares. In 1 month, the Woods had given up one secret, but the biggest question remained. Who took Angie? Who tortured her? Who left her to die in that dark forest, just a child surrounded by silence? And the scariest part? That man was still out there, still walking free, and no one knew who he was. We're not done. The case was about to go cold, but decades later, science would do what witnesses and sketches could not. The truth would rise, years too late. Subscribe and stay locked in as we follow the trail that finally caught a killer. The death of Angie Houseman should have sparked swift justice. The evidence was brutal. The crime was vicious. And the community? Begging for answers. But after the discovery in the woods, something strange happened. Everything went quiet. The police had her body. They had a fingerprint. They had details so horrifying they made headlines across the country. But they had no suspect, no name, no face, just nothing. That fingerprint on the duct tape, it went nowhere. The national database had no matches. And so the fingerprint sat, logged, stored, waiting for a future that no one could promise. The case, meanwhile, was unraveling. Tips kept coming, but they were mostly dead ends. Psychics called in. Some claimed they'd seen Angie in visions. One even gave an exact location, a national park 25 miles away. Police didn't buy it, and honestly, they were running out of hope. But then came something weird. A prison inmate named Corey Fox contacted police. He claimed to have killed Angie along with over 10 others. He said he'd abducted her with a friend, held her captive, tried to demand a ransom, then panicked and decided to kill her. His story was dark. He described tying her to a tree, using underwear as a gag, even mentioned the forest, too detailed to ignore. Had he really done it? Detectives rushed to interview him, but the deeper they looked, the more the cracks showed. Fox claimed they'd used plastic handcuffs, but Angie had been tied with metal cuffs. He said they killed her early on, but Angie had been kept alive for 9 days. He confessed to murders he couldn't have committed, confirmed by solid alibis. Corey Fox wasn't a killer. He was a liar, a disturbed man clinging to attention. Case closed again. Another false hope crushed. And yet, something kept nagging at the detectives. Why was it so hard to catch this killer? Why no trail? Why no DNA match? And then they remembered something that hadn't made sense at the time. When Angie's body was discovered, another man was there. A guy sitting in a parked car nearby. Police talked to him. His name was Roger Lee Martin. He said he was there to hunt, but he had no gear in his car. Strange. Still, no one pressed too hard. They were overwhelmed, focused on other leads. But in 2007, a new team of detectives went back through the case files. They found Roger Martin's name, and then they dug deeper. Roger had a criminal record, a bad one. He'd been convicted of multiple sexual offenses against children. And one of those assaults? It happened near the exact area where Angie's body was found. And here's the kicker. All of those crimes happened before 1993, before Angie's death. That meant his record should have come up at the time. But it didn't. It was buried, overlooked. Missed. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe it was lack of resources. Either way, a man who had preyed on children before, who had no reason to be in that forest, who had been at the scene, was let go. And now, he was gone. Detectives tracked down everything they could on Roger. They discovered he'd moved, changed addresses, slipped out of sight. They brought him in for questioning again. He denied everything, said he was just hunting, said he never even knew who Angie was. They had no physical evidence, no DNA, just a feeling. So once again he walked free. The phantom suspect had slipped away, and for years, that's all Angie had, Shadows. A case no one could close, a killer no one could name. But science was catching up, and when it did, everything would change. Don't miss what comes next, because decades after her murder, a stunning twist would reopen the case, and finally, someone would answer for Angie's death. If you're still here, it means you care. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Let's keep the pressure on and keep Angie's memory alive. She deserved better. Her family deserved answers, and they were finally on their way. For years, the Angie Houseman case stood still, frozen in time, much like the way she died. Detectives retired. Leads dried up. The case file collected dust. And yet, it never left anyone's mind. Not in Missouri. Not in the hearts of those who had searched the woods for her. Not in the nightmares of a community that still locked its doors tighter every November. But what no one could have predicted, what even the killer probably didn't know, was that a tiny sliver of DNA had survived, and the science to unlock its secret was catching up fast. It was 2019. 26 years had passed. The fingerprint from the duct tape still sat in evidence. So did trace DNA from the tape, her clothing, and the plastic bag found at the scene. In 1993, that DNA wasn't enough. Too degraded, too partial, useless. But now, forensic technology had evolved. Thanks to genetic genealogy, the process that had unmasked the Golden State Killer, detectives could run crime scene DNA through public genealogy databases, not just criminal ones. It wasn't a match to a name. It was a match to a family tree. And this time the DNA spoke. Working with genealogists, detectives followed the branches backward. The strand of DNA led to several relatives, then narrowed down to one possible man. A man who had flown under the radar. A man with no criminal record in 1993. A man who had once lived in Missouri, not far from Angie's home. His name was Earl Webster Cox. To most, Cox was a ghost, a name buried in sealed files. But when the police pulled his records, a dark, disturbing life unraveled. Earl Cox was a former U.S. Air Force computer technician. But in the 1980s, he was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged for sexually abusing young girls. After that, he moved around. In 1989, he was arrested in Colorado for molesting another child. He pleaded guilty, but somehow he stayed out of the spotlight. Eventually, he returned to Missouri. And in 1993, around the time Angie was abducted, he was living in the St. Louis area. He matched the psychological profile. He matched the timeline. He matched the DNA. When detectives confronted Cox with the evidence, he didn't confess. He lawyered up. But prosecutors didn't need a confession. They had forensic proof that Cox's DNA was on the duct tape used to wrap Angie's face. They had him. In June 2019, Earl Webster Cox was formally charged with Angie Houseman's kidnapping and murder. It had taken 26 years. But justice had finally knocked on the door. The case shocked the public all over again. How had this man slipped through? How had someone with such a horrifying past lived free for so long? And worse, was Angie his only victim? Some detectives believe she wasn't. One theory suggested Cox may have been part of a child pornography ring operating across state lines. Investigators found that he'd uploaded and distributed thousands of illicit images online. Could her abduction have been planned? Was there a network? Was someone else involved? Those questions still haunt the case today. Earl Cox never stood trial. His health deteriorated while awaiting trial in federal custody. In August 2022, he died in prison before he could be convicted. There was no courtroom drama, no verdict read aloud, No chance for Angie's family to stare him down in court. Just a cold end to a monstrous life. But even in death, Cox's identity gave closure. The man who murdered Angie had a name. For 26 years, Angie's killer was a phantom, a shadow lurking in old case files. And then, science pulled him into the light. The fingerprint that led nowhere, the DNA too small to analyze, they told the truth, after all. Earl Cox had taken her, tortured her, left her to die. But he didn't win, because the world never forgot her name. Angie Houseman, 9 years old, a face no one should ever forget. Technology brought a killer to justice. And her story isn't just a tragedy, it's a testament to perseverance, to progress, to the power of never giving up. If you believe that every cold case matters, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and help share Angie's voice. We may never hear her speak again, but together we can make sure she's heard. Angie Houseman's story didn't end in the woods. It didn't end in 1993. It didn't end in the court system either. It lived on in every child who walked home from school under tighter watch, in every parent who clutched their little one just a second longer, and in every detective who reopened a cold file because they believed there was still hope. Even after her death, Angie created change. Following the gruesome discovery in Bush Wildlife Area, public outrage soared. Missouri lawmakers were pressured to reevaluate how missing children cases were handled. There were too many gaps, too many failures, and Angie wasn't the only one. Over the next several years, Missouri rolled out tighter child protection measures, increased statewide communication between law enforcement agencies, and pushed for better forensic preservation of evidence from crime scenes. Because back then, DNA was still an emerging science. But Angie's case showed the cost of delay. It proved what could happen when the only thing between life and death was a few lost minutes or a missed connection. But her legacy didn't just live in policy, it lived in technology. When genetic genealogy caught Earl Cox in 2019, Angie's name was written alongside the growing list of cases being solved decades after the fact. This wasn't just a victory for her family. It was a warning to predators everywhere. You can't hide forever. Your DNA will betray you. Your past will catch up. Your name will surface. There's another piece to Angie's story, the emotional legacy. Her teachers remember her as bright, sweet, and talkative. Her classmates never forgot her smile. She was the kind of kid who'd draw pictures for her friends and hand out hugs like candy. At home, she loved coloring, cartoons, chocolate milk. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian because animals are nicer than people. The irony of that quote cuts deep now, but it also gives us something else. Perspective. Angie wasn't just a face on a flyer or a segment on the news. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a dreamer. And because the world refused to forget her, the truth came out. Because the community refused to let her be just another cold case, justice arrived, eventually. Because technology refused to stand still, her killer's name is now history. In the years since her case was solved, countless podcasts, documentaries, articles, and YouTube creators, like this channel, have taken up Angie's story. Not just to revisit tragedy, but to remind the world. This is why we don't give up. Because somewhere out there is another family waiting, another child missing, another case unsolved. And every time we raise our voices for victims like Angie, we close that distance. We light another path. We fight back. There are two kinds of silence, the kind that hides the truth and the kind that echoes through history until it finds justice. Angie's voice was taken, but now it speaks louder than ever. Let her legacy be a call to action. If you've made it this far, thank you. You didn't just hear a story. You stood witness to a tragedy that became a movement. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment her name below. Let's flood this platform with her memory. Let's prove that Angie Houseman was never just another victim. She was a light, and we're keeping it burning. Behind every cold case, there are faces the public never sees. They don't hold press conferences. They don't make headlines. They're not in the news cycle. But they keep going, year after year. because the weight of silence never really lifts until someone makes it speak. In the case of Angie Houseman, there were many who gave up hope, but more importantly, there were a few who didn't. Detective Tom Carroll was one of them. He had worked on dozens of missing children cases, but Angie stuck with him, haunted him. He never forgot the scene in the woods, never stopped thinking about what she might have gone through in those 9 days. Even after the case went cold, he checked the file every year, sometimes just to reread her school photo, sometimes to make sure her evidence was still preserved correctly. In 2001, when the community donated a $250,000 reward to reignite the search, Carroll was among the first to push it forward. "We owe her that," he said. "She didn't get a chance to grow up. We owe her every hour we've got left." Then there was FBI agent Michael Parker, who had a background in digital forensics. In the early 2000s, long before genetic genealogy was a buzzword, he began advocating for new testing methods to revisit cases like Angie's. At the time, the technology didn't exist to extract viable matches from such degraded DNA. But Parker kept notes, cross-referencing what samples existed with every emerging lab process being tested across the country. Years later, his early groundwork would form the basis for the genealogy process that ultimately exposed Earl Cox. He didn't get credit, but he didn't want it. When asked about Angie, all he said was, "I've got a daughter the same age. There was no way I was letting this one go." And then there was Angie's mother, Teresa. The media often painted her as broken, reclusive, silent. What they didn't see were the nights she stood on her porch, looking down the street. The hundreds of letters she sent to news stations. The countless prayers, candles, visits to the woods where Angie was found. For 26 years, Teresa never moved out of the house Angie left from. "I couldn't," she told reporters later. "What if she came home?" She left her daughter's room untouched for nearly 3 decades. Even when everyone else moved on, she stayed frozen in time. Angie's classmates became parents of their own. One of them, Lisa, now a mother of 3, helped lead the petition to rename a section of the local trail after Angie. She told City Council, "She only made it halfway home. Let's make sure every other child makes it the whole way." Today, a bench sits on that trail with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Angie Houseman. May every child walk in peace." And then came the new generation of digital detectives, podcasters, journalists, YouTubers, bloggers. They took Angie's story, Faded and Buried, and made it viral again. They weren't constrained by bureaucracy or chain of command. They had something more powerful, reach. It was a Reddit post that first reignited interest in the case back in 2018. A true crime podcast picked it up months later, and then the dominoes began to fall. When the FBI realized people still cared, they prioritized the case again. It sounds small, but in true crime, noise matters. Sometimes justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts with one person who refuses to stop asking questions, who won't let the file stay closed, who lights a fire that others keep alive. Angie's case reminds us of something vital. Justice is not a moment. It's a movement. If you're part of that movement, this is your moment. Don't just watch. Don't just scroll. Comment her name. Share her face. Speak her story. Because the more we say her name, the more we remind the world that Angie mattered, that she was loved, and that monsters don't win when we never let victims be forgotten. Angie Marie Houseman was only 9 years old. She loved animals. She drew pictures in class. She laughed with her friends. She asked too many questions. She wore her heart wide open. She never got to grow up. But she did something most of us never do. She changed the world. Her murder was a scar that never healed, not just for her family, but for an entire generation. Her case shaped how schools supervise children, how law enforcement handles missing persons, how forensic evidence is stored, re-examined, and respected. But more than that, Angie's story became a signal flare in the dark, a reminder that behind every cold case is a warm life lost, that the victims are never just names or case numbers. They were children, sisters, best friends, bright futures, and we owe them our voices. Angie never got to speak again, but we can. We can speak for her. We can remind the world that even the darkest stories can end with light if we keep pushing, if we never stop sharing, if we never stop demanding answers, because justice doesn't rest, and silence helps no one. This is your moment to be part of something bigger than just watching. Share this video, post her name, keep talking about Angie, and the next time you hear about a missing child, don't scroll past it. You could be the noise that makes the system move. You could be the echo that keeps the memory alive. Because if Angie taught us anything, it's this. Never give up. Not on the case. Not on justice. Not on a little girl who only made it halfway home. Subscribe for more unsolved cases, survivor stories, and the truth that still hides in silence. Like, comment, share. Let's make sure Angie's voice never fades. Comment, justice for Angie Houseman. Let's fill the internet with her name. Let's make sure she is never forgotten. It was a chilly November evening in northern Italy. The streets of Brembate di Sopra were quiet, too quiet. A town so small, where most people knew each other by name, where doors were left unlocked, where nothing ever happened. But something did happen, and it would shatter every illusion of safety. 13-year-old Yara Gambarejo had just left the gym. It was barely 5:15 p.m., and home was only a short walk away, just a few hundred yards. She promised her parents she'd be back soon. She never made it. And in that moment, something horrifying took root in the heart of this peaceful community. What began as a simple missing persons case would explode into one of the most chilling and complex murder investigations Italy had ever seen, one filled with media frenzy, forensic dead ends, thousands of DNA tests, and a trail that would take years to unravel. This is not just a story about a disappearance. This is a story about obsession, about one detective who refused to give up, and about a killer hiding in plain sight, missing girl, gym clothes, safe neighborhood, no suspects. Yara was a promising young gymnast, smart, kind, driven. Her dream? Competing for Italy someday. On November 26, 2010, she left her house with one simple errand. Drop off a stereo to her gymnastics coach. She told her mom she'd be back in an hour. But as the clock ticked towards 7 p.m. and darkness settled over the town, her mother grew anxious. She dialed Yara's phone. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Still nothing. Something was wrong. Yara's parents contacted the police. At first, no one panicked. She's probably with friends, they thought. Maybe she lost track of time. But by nightfall, the worst fear had already begun to creep in. This was not like Yara. Within hours, a full-scale search was underway. Police officers scoured the streets. Firefighters dredged nearby rivers. Volunteers fanned out with flashlights through fields and alleyways. Even dogs were brought in to trace her scent. But Yara was gone. Vanished, without a trace. And that's when the story stopped being local and exploded nationwide. How could a girl just disappear in a town this small? This wasn't a big city. It wasn't a place plagued by crime. This was a postcard-perfect town where nothing ever happened. And that's what made it so terrifying. In the days that followed, a single terrifying truth became clear. Someone had taken her, but no one saw who. No one heard anything. No one could even guess why. And that's what made this story different from most. There was no ransom note, no suspicious vehicle footage, no struggle, just silence. And behind that silence, a predator. The first 48 hours in any disappearance are crucial. In Yara's case, those hours slipped by in a haze of false hopes and missed chances. The police moved fast. The lead investigator, Letizia Ruggieri, was assigned almost immediately. A seasoned detective, she'd seen her share of missing persons, but something about this case felt different. Yara wasn't rebellious. She wasn't known to wander off. And nothing in her home life raised red flags. This wasn't a runaway. This was a vanishing. Ruggieri launched a full-scale investigation. She brought in military police, search and rescue dogs, aerial drones, helicopters, But most importantly, she wanted eyes on the last place Yara was seen, the gym. Witnesses came forward. Her coach confirmed Yara had come by the gym around 5:30 p.m. She had returned the stereo, chatted with some friends, and even did a few warm-up exercises. Then she said goodbye. She walked out. Into the night. She never made it home. The last known contact was a text Yara sent to a friend at 6:44 p.m. It was nothing unusual. No cries for help. No fear. Just a teenager making plans for the next day. But it would be the last time anyone ever heard from her. Red Jury's team began reconstructing the possible timeline. The route between the gym and Yara's home was short, just a few minutes' walk. She should have been back by 6 p.m. Instead, by 7:11, her phone was already off. That's when a strange detail emerged. The search dogs picked up Yara's scent, but instead of leading toward her house, they moved in the opposite direction, toward a nearby town called Mapello. Even more disturbing, her cell phone pinged a tower in Mapello at 6:49 p.m. That was just 5 minutes after she sent her last text. There was only one explanation. Yara didn't walk to Mapello. She was taken there by car. Now the investigation took a darker turn. If she had been abducted, who would do it? And more importantly, why? Ruggieri began cross-referencing the cell phone tower data with every device connected to that network during the critical time frame. The results were staggering. Over 15,000 mobile numbers had passed through the area that night. That meant 15,000 possible suspects. She narrowed the list. Phones that pinged the tower around 6:49 p.m. People with no clear reason to be in Mapello. And anyone with a prior criminal record. But it still wasn't enough. Meanwhile, the search on the ground continued. Local fields were combed again and again. Rivers dragged. Homes searched. Posters of Yara's face covered every lamppost in town. Then came a possible break. Several people near the gym claimed they saw a girl matching Yara's description speaking with two men near a red car. Was this the abduction in plain sight? Red Jury's team scoured CCTV footage. They tracked every red vehicle registered in the region. But frustratingly, the tip didn't hold. The footage was grainy. No license plate was visible. And the identities of the two men never confirmed. It was a clue, but not one they could act on. Still, the red car stayed in the back of Red Jury's mind. The investigation was already making headlines across Italy. Everyone wanted to know, where is Yara? But weeks passed, then months, and nothing. Not a single trace. Until one day, a man's voice, picked up on a wiretap, shocked the entire task force. "Forgive me, Lord. I didn't kill her." The man was Mohammed Fikri, a Moroccan construction worker. He lived in the area. He had no alibi for the night Yara vanished. And now he was caught saying something that sounded like a confession. It was the first real lead in weeks. But there was a problem. The call was 3 days old. Fikri had already boarded a ferry heading for Morocco. In an emergency operation, the police intercepted the ship, arrested Fikri, and brought him back to Italy. His car was found. In the trunk, a mattress covered in blood. It all looked damning. For a brief moment, Italy believed the nightmare was over. But the blood wasn't human, and the translation of the call had been wrong. What Fikri actually said was, "Forgive me, Lord. I wasn't able to help her." The case against him crumbled. The blood was animal. The mattress was used for transporting meat. Fikri was innocent. And just like that, they were back to square one. Ruggieri didn't give up. She still had the massive database of phone numbers from Mapello. She still had the red car. She still had the scent trail. And she had a town that had gone from hopeful to haunted. Exactly 3 months after Yara Gambarejo disappeared, the truth emerged from the ground. Quietly, accidentally, and in the most unexpected way. It was February 26th, 2011. A man was flying his remote-controlled airplane in a remote field near the town of Scignolo di Isola, about 6 miles from Brembate. His plane hit some turbulence and crash-landed in a patch of thick, dry grass. As he went to retrieve it, something strange caught his eye. A bundle of rags. At first, he thought it was garbage, but then he saw something protruding from the pile, a boot. He froze. It wasn't trash. It was a body. The police arrived within the hour. So did Letizia Ruggieri. The scene was grim. The remains were badly decomposed, exposed to months of harsh winter weather. But there was something chillingly familiar. The body was wearing the same tracksuit Yara had worn to the gym. Her house keys were nearby. So was the SIM card from her phone and the removable battery. But the phone itself was missing. Letizia didn't need confirmation. She already knew. This was Yara. The town went silent. The hope that had kept people searching for 90 days collapsed into grief. Italy's top forensic pathologist was called in. The autopsy revealed a devastating picture. Yara had suffered multiple stab wounds, several bruises, deep cuts on her wrists and legs. There were no signs of sexual assault, but the pattern of her wounds suggested a prolonged attack. Her clothing had been partially removed, adding weight to the theory of a sexually motivated crime. Even if it wasn't completed, there were also traces of lime dust on her body, commonly found in construction materials. To Letizia, this meant one thing. The killer worked in construction. He didn't just dump the body. He had time. He planned it. But the most important discovery wasn't visible to the naked eye. Forensic experts found 2 samples of foreign DNA, one on Yara's glove, another on the battery from her missing phone. The samples were small, but clear, and, crucially, they didn't belong to anyone in Yara's family or social circle. This was the breakthrough Ruggieri had been waiting for. But there was a problem. The DNA didn't match anyone in the national database. So, she took the most ambitious step yet. She divided her team into specialized units. One focused on phone data. Another was assigned to collect DNA samples from everyone even remotely connected to the crime. Yara's friends, gym employees, neighbors, volunteers who helped in the search, anyone whose phone pinged near Mapello or Scignolo on the night of her disappearance. And that was just the beginning. Ruggieri's teams collected over 22,000 DNA samples. They called it the pyramid, a methodical narrowing of suspects, starting from the base and moving upward one swab at a time. It was one of the largest DNA dragnet operations in European history. For months, there was silence. Lab after lab returned the same result. Not a match. Not a match. Not a match. The media began to doubt her. They called the DNA dragnet a witch hunt. Politicians accused Ruggieri of wasting taxpayer money. Journalists demanded she be pulled off the case. But Letizia didn't care. She wasn't building a case for the headlines. She was building a case for Yara. And in time, she found what she was looking for. It happened late in 2011. A sample came back with a partial match, not to the killer, but to someone related to the killer. His name was Damiano Garanoni. But Damiano had an alibi. He was out of the country during Yara's abduction. So, how could his DNA show up on her body? That's when Ruggieri realized this wasn't their guy, but it was his relative. The DNA on Yara's underwear belonged to someone closely related to Damiano, possibly a father, uncle, or brother. Letizia turned her team to the Garanoni family tree. She began ordering samples from every living male relative. She even looked into deceased ones, hoping preserved medical records or forgotten personal items might hold DNA evidence. It was grueling work, slow, painstaking, and politically risky. But Ruggieri had no choice. The killer was in that family. She just had to find him. By the end of 2011, the entire investigation was focused on one name, Garanoni. The DNA from Yara's body had spoken. Whoever left, it was directly related to the Garanoni family, likely a biological son of a man named Giuseppe Garanoni, a former bus driver who had died years earlier. Letizia Ruggieri and her team tracked down Giuseppe's 2 legitimate sons, both middle-aged professionals with clean records. She ordered DNA tests for both of them. Negative. Neither man was a match. So, how could Giuseppe be the killer's father if none of his sons matched the DNA? That's when Ruggieri realized the unthinkable. Giuseppe must have had a child no one knew about. The theory was risky. She would need to prove that Giuseppe fathered a secret, illegitimate child decades ago, and that this hidden child had grown up to become Yara's killer. Ruggieri dug into Giuseppe's personal life. She discovered that from the 1960s to the 1980s, he had regularly vacationed alone at a spa resort in San Pellegrino Terme, without his wife. Every May, he stayed there for 2 weeks. No family, no explanations. Was it just a getaway? Or something more? Letizia ordered the retrieval of archival records from the resort, guest registries, spa treatments, housekeeping logs. Astonishingly, many of the handwritten records had survived. She compared the guest lists. Year after year, she searched for overlapping female names, women who stayed at the same time as Giuseppe. Her team compiled hundreds of names, each one a potential link to the killer. And then in 2013, 3 years after Yara's disappearance, Letizia got the first real lead. A woman named Esther Arzuffi had appeared multiple times on the old registries. She had lived in the area, and in a twist that no one saw coming, the police had already collected her DNA years earlier during their original dragnet. Because Esther had 2 sons, one of them had visited a nightclub near the field where Yara's body was found. One of those sons had provided a DNA sample. It hadn't matched at the time, but now, the connection to Giuseppe Garanoni opened a new door. Ruggieri ordered the team to retest the sample. This time, not against Yara's DNA, but against Giuseppe's. The result? A 100% match. Esther Arzuffi had a son whose biological father was Giuseppe Garanoni, and that son was now the prime suspect in the murder of Yara Gambarejo. His name was Massimo Giuseppe Bassetti. He was a 44-year-old construction worker, married, 3 kids, lived in Mapello, the same town where Yara's phone had last pinged. He had no criminal record. He had never once appeared on the police radar during the original investigation. He was the definition of ordinary, but his DNA matched the killer's perfectly. Letizia had him placed under covert surveillance. His movements were tracked, his phone tapped, his habits recorded. And one day, while Bassetti was sipping coffee during a work break, he tossed a used paper napkin in the trash. Police grabbed it, sent it to the lab, tested the saliva. The result came back, match. The DNA on the napkin was identical to the DNA found on Yara's underwear. It was over. After 4 years, Letizia had found her killer. Bassetti was arrested in June 2014. Quiet, no resistance, just confusion on his face. But the evidence? Overwhelming. Massimo Bassetti's arrest sent shockwaves across Italy. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a father of 3, a quiet mason, a man whose children went to school just like Yara. A man who lived a short drive away from her gym. To the public, it didn't make sense. But to Detective Letizia Ruggieri, the evidence was clear. His DNA was on Yara's body. He was in the area that night. He had no real alibi. Bassetti denied everything. He claimed he had never met Yara, had no idea how his DNA ended up on her clothing, and accused the police of framing him. His lawyers argued that the DNA sample could have been contaminated or mishandled during processing. But behind the scenes, the case was building fast. Investigators searched Bassetti's home, work van, and electronics. On his laptop, they found something disturbing. Over 100 explicit searches for underage girls. He had also conducted bizarre online queries, like, how long does DNA last on a corpse? Missing girls in Bergamo. How to erase phone records. To the prosecution, this was a window into his mind. To the defense, circumstantial, misinterpreted. They claimed multiple people had used the computer. But the biggest blow came when the lab confirmed, again, that Bassetti's DNA was an exact match to the sample found on Yara's body. The defense then pivoted. If the DNA was real, they said it must have been transferred indirectly, perhaps from a shared gym mat, a communal space, a mistake. But the prosecution had one powerful rebuttal. The DNA was found on Yara's underwear, a highly intimate location. There was no plausible explanation for indirect transfer to that spot. The media called it Italy's trial of the century. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters from around the world chronicled each detail. TV channels aired hour-by-hour coverage. Experts debated the ethics of the massive DNA dragnet that led to Bassetti. And public opinion split in two. Some saw him as a cold-blooded killer who had evaded justice for years. Others believed he was a scapegoat, a convenient name pinned to an unsolved tragedy. But then the prosecution brought in the final, devastating piece of evidence. A torn SIM card and phone battery found near Yara's body. Traces of Bassetti's DNA were found on both. Not just on her underwear. This meant he had handled her phone. Possibly removed the battery. Possibly destroyed it to prevent tracking. The defense was running out of arguments. They attacked the chain of custody. They claimed investigative bias. They even attempted to suggest Yara died elsewhere, and someone planted the body to mislead authorities. But no alternate suspect ever surfaced. On July 1st, 2016, nearly 6 years after Yara's disappearance, the court delivered its verdict. Massimo Giuseppe Bassetti was found guilty of the murder of Yara Gambarejo. He was sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom erupted. Some cried. Others clapped. Yara's parents sat silently, relieved, but forever shattered. But the case didn't end there. Bassetti appealed. Multiple times. Each time, he claimed his innocence. Each time, the courts upheld the conviction. To this day, he maintains that he is not the killer. But the courts, the forensic experts, and most of the Italian public disagree. When news broke that Yara's killer had finally been found, the nation of Italy exploded. Breaking! DNA match confirms identity of Yara Gambarejo's killer after 4 years. After endless press conferences, missteps, and dead ends, a face had finally been put to the monster. And that face was Massimo Giuseppe Bassetti, an ordinary-looking man with soft eyes, a slight frame, and no criminal past. It was unthinkable. Bassetti was a family man. He had a wife, kids, a steady job. He blended in so well he had even volunteered in the search for Yara. But now the DNA didn't lie. When the arrest was announced, the media called it the trial of the century. And in many ways, it was because the evidence was both irrefutable and entirely circumstantial. Bassetti had no relationship to Yara, no motive. There were no witnesses, no video, no murder weapon. The prosecution's case boiled down to one thing: DNA, found on Yara's underwear, found again on a discarded napkin, and matched to a man who didn't even know he was illegitimate. That's right, Bassetti had no idea that Giuseppe Garanoni was his biological father. The revelation destroyed his family life. His mother, Esther Arzuffi, denied the affair to the bitter end, despite the scientific proof. In court, Bassetti looked confused, worried, stunned, and then he said the words that would dominate the headlines for months. "I'm innocent. I've never even met Yara." The defense's strategy was simple: discredit the DNA. They argued that the sample could have been contaminated. It was too old. The lab procedures were flawed. There were no other pieces of physical evidence linking Bassetti to the crime. And perhaps their strongest point: Bassetti's DNA was nowhere on Yara's body, only on her underwear. How could a killer in such a violent crime leave zero trace on the victim, but only a microscopic sample in one place? It created reasonable doubt, and the defense leaned hard into that. But Letizia Ruggieri and the prosecution came prepared. They had meticulously reconstructed the entire timeline. Bassetti's phone had gone silent at the same time Yara disappeared. His work truck was spotted near the gym that evening, caught by a surveillance camera, barely visible. Lime dust, the same type found on Yara's body, was also found in his van and on his tools. The prosecution argued that this wasn't just a coincidence. It was a pattern. They also pointed out Bassetti's internet search history, which included highly suspicious keywords, including girl, suffering, 13-year-old gymnasts, torture. Bassetti claimed those searches were accidental. He blamed viruses, misclicks, pop-ups, but the jury wasn't convinced. As the trial dragged into 2015, the courtroom became a spectacle. Yara's grieving parents sat quietly day after day, eyes down. Bassetti's wife, at first supportive, began to drift away. Reporters fought for seats. TV shows dissected the case every night. And all the while, Bassetti stuck to his story. He was innocent. The DNA must be wrong. He had never seen the girl before in his life. But the forensic experts didn't budge. The Y chromosome from the crime scene matched the Garanoni family. The autosomal DNA matched Bassetti specifically. It was statistically a 1 in a billion match. And finally, in July 2016, nearly 6 years after Yara vanished, the court delivered its verdict. Guilty. Massimo Bassetti was sentenced to life in prison. But the story wasn't over. The courtroom may have closed its doors. The sentence may have been signed. But across Italy, the ghost of Yara Gambareggio's case refused arrest. Because even after Massimo Bassetti's life sentence was upheld by the Supreme Court, questions still haunted the public consciousness. Some weren't asking who killed Yara anymore. They were asking something even more disturbing. Did they convict the wrong man? Let's go back to the DNA, because that's the heart of this case. The prosecution's case rested entirely on a full profile found on Yara's underwear. That profile was dubbed Ignoto 1 Unknown 1 and matched to Massimo Bassetti through his father's secret lineage. But here's the twist. Forensic experts never found Bassetti's mitochondrial DNA on the sample. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the maternal line, and it should have been there if the DNA truly came from Bassetti. The defense jumped on this, arguing that the sample was contaminated or possibly from someone else in the Garanoni bloodline. The prosecution argued the sample had degraded, and that mitochondrial DNA often breaks down more quickly than nuclear DNA. But to the public, this became a key question. How could the most decisive piece of evidence in the trial have such a glaring scientific gap? Then came the issue of missing evidence. In 2020, it was revealed that 54 key DNA samples linked to the case had mysteriously vanished or been exhausted during testing before any defense experts could independently review them. This revelation triggered a firestorm. Prominent defense attorneys, journalists, and members of the public began asking, were investigators too aggressive in building a case? Was there confirmation bias after years of pressure to find a suspect? Could Bassetti's DNA have been transferred innocently, perhaps by contaminated laundry, shared surfaces, or even lab error? None of these questions could be definitively answered, because the evidence was gone. In the years that followed, Bassetti became a symbol, not just of guilt or innocence, but of how fragile truth can be in the justice system. From his prison cell, Bassetti continued to write letters. I am innocent. They needed someone to blame, and they chose me. His legal team filed new motions asking for further genetic testing and even pushing for a retrial in the European Court of Human Rights. Meanwhile, Yara's family stayed silent. They never gave dramatic interviews, never spoke at rallies, never criticized the verdict. To them, the loss of their daughter was a private wound, not a courtroom debate. But for the rest of Italy, the case had become something more than a murder. It had become a mirror reflecting the fear, faith, and flaws in a system that promised justice but could never offer certainty. Years have passed, but Yara's story still echoes. Her photo still appears on tribute walls. Her name is still whispered in documentaries and classrooms. Her case is still taught in forensic science programs and law schools, not because it was solved, but because even when solved, it left so many questions unanswered. And so, the story ends, not with closure, but with a question. Was justice truly served? Or did the real killer disappear that night just as silently as Yara did? A quiet town, a stolen life, a mystery that split a nation. Do you believe the right man was convicted? Or is there more to the story than we were told? Subscribe for more chilling true crime cases. Leave a comment below, was Bassetti guilty? Or is this another case of justice gone wrong? A 15-year-old girl vanishes on a summer day, a path she's walked dozens of times before becomes a corridor of nightmares. Her body is found just hours later, violated, stabbed, discarded, and then silence. Decades of it. But this is not where the story ends. This is where it begins. Glen Ellen, Illinois, a quiet suburban town just west of Chicago. July 21st, 1985. The kind of summer day that seems frozen in time. Cicadas buzz in the treetops. Lawn sprinklers hiss in rhythmic bursts. Children roam the sidewalks, free from the demands of school. There's a comfort in the ordinariness of it all, a kind of American innocence. But for one family, that illusion would shatter before the sun could set. Christy Wesselman was 15, a rising sophomore at Glenbard South High School. Blonde, athletic, bubbly. She was known for her smile, her volleyball skills, and a heart that beat a little faster when she talked about her dreams. That Sunday afternoon, she walked to the nearby Jewel Osco grocery store on Butterfield Road. Just a short trip to buy a candy bar and a soda. Her mom expected her back within the hour, but she never came home. Act I, the disappearance. It was around 3:30 p.m. when Christy stepped out of her family's home on Golden Hill Avenue. She was wearing a white tank top, blue shorts, and gym shoes. A simple outfit for a quick errand. The Jewel store was less than a mile away. Christy had walked that route many times before. Down the sidewalk, across the street, past a field of wild grasses. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Or so everyone believed. When Christy didn't return within the hour, her mother, Sandra Wesselman, felt a pang of concern. Maybe Christy had stopped to chat with a friend. Maybe she got distracted. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, and dinner time came and went, that concern turned to fear. By nightfall, Christy's absence had become unbearable. Her family began to call neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen her. At approximately 1:50 a.m., with no sign of Christy and no word from anyone who had seen her, Sandra called the police. Officers from the DuPage County Sheriff's Office responded immediately. They knew the area well. They also knew Christy's family. Glen Ellen was a close-knit community, the kind where everybody knew everybody. A missing teenage girl wasn't just a statistic here. It was personal. Deputies retraced Christy's expected path to the store. The Jewel employees remembered her clearly. She had arrived sometime around 4 p.m., bought a candy bar and a soda, and left alone. There was nothing suspicious about her behavior. She didn't seem distressed or followed. She smiled at the cashier, but that smile would be the last anyone ever saw. In the early morning hours of July 22nd, a search team fanned out along the wooded areas between the store and Christy's home. Flashlights pierced the darkness. Officers called her name. And then, in a secluded stretch of tall grass near a footpath commonly used by locals, they made the discovery no one wanted to make. Christy's body was found partially clothed. Her shoes and socks were missing. Her white tank top was stained and torn. She had been sexually assaulted. 8 stab wounds pierced her chest and abdomen. A gin shoelace had been tightly wound around her neck. The scene was devastating. For the officers who discovered her. For her family, who clung to hope until the final word. For a town that would never be the same again. Christy Wesselman had walked a mile to the store. She never made it back. And her killer? He had vanished without a trace. The days turned to weeks. The community of Glen Ellen was drowning in sorrow and in fear. Christy Wesselman's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a rupture in the illusion of safety. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter. Teenagers canceled their weekend jogs. And the peaceful silence of Churchill Woods was replaced by suspicion, anxiety, and the ever-present whisper. Who could have done this? Police had a body. They had a crime scene. But they didn't have a killer. The autopsy confirmed the community's worst fears. Christy had been sexually assaulted, strangled. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the public alike. But the scene told investigators almost nothing. There were no clear fingerprints, no signs of a struggle, no weapon, no witness. Just a bright summer day turned into a haunting silence. The FBI joined in. State police were called. This wasn't just any case. This was the murder of a young, promising girl right in the heart of suburban Illinois. Investigators launched a massive manhunt. They scoured the woods. They canvassed every house in the area. They questioned every known offender, every transient, every stranger who had been seen within a 10-mile radius of the park. They even brought in canine units. The scent trail led only a short distance, then vanished. Whoever had done this had either planned it or gotten incredibly lucky, or maybe they knew the area, maybe they were one of them. A neighbor, a familiar face. The question gripped Glenn Ellen like a vice. Was the killer someone they all knew? A community on edge. Back at Glenbard West High School, Christie's desk sat empty. The halls were quieter. Cheer practice stopped. Cross-country meets were canceled. Her teammates, her friends, her teachers were all thrust into a spiral of grief. The town held vigils. Candles lit up the night. Pictures of Christie, smiling, young, alive, were taped to telephone poles and church doors. They weren't just mourning her. They were pleading with anyone who might know something, anything, to come forward. But the silence was deafening. Police followed hundreds of leads. They spoke with delivery drivers, joggers, and passers-by who were in Churchill Woods that day. They even questioned the gas station clerk where Christie was last seen buying a Coke. He remembered her. Friendly, laughing, alone. But he didn't remember anyone suspicious. No strange men. No strange cars. Just a normal Saturday afternoon. Just like any other, until it wasn't. A sketch, a dead end. A few days later, a woman came forward. She believed she had seen a man near the area at the time of the murder. He was white, mid-20s, muscular, curly hair. He wore jeans, no shirt, and had a bandana tied around his forehead. It wasn't much, but it was something. Police had a sketch drawn up. It was circulated through newspapers, posted on bulletin boards, featured on the evening news. The community held its breath. But no one recognized the man. No neighbors, no co-workers, no one from the local gym, no one from the school. It was a face that belonged to no one. And soon, like the summer heat, the trail began to fade. A town trapped in memory. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed. Not because the police gave up, because the leads dried up. Every suspect was cleared. Every tip led nowhere. The sketch was eventually taken down. The flowers at Christie's memorial wilted. The media moved on. But Glenn Ellen never did. Especially not the Wesselman family. Every day was a struggle. Every night, a torment. Christie's mother clung to the last things her daughter ever touched. Her bedroom was preserved, untouched. Her clothes still folded. Her notes still pinned on the wall. They wanted answers. But more than anything, they wanted justice. And they weren't going to let Christie become just another unsolved file. The DNA revolution. By the early 1990s, DNA technology was advancing, but slowly. The concept of using biological evidence to catch criminals was still new, still fragile, and for years inconclusive. But investigators preserved the evidence from Christie's body, meticulously, hoping, praying, that one day the science would catch up. In 2000, the case was re-examined. Samples were tested again, more refined, more precise. This time they got a DNA profile. It was a full, genetic fingerprint of Christie Wesselman's killer. It didn't match anyone in the system, not in Illinois, not in the FBI database, but it meant something important. If they ever found a man who did it, they'd know. Immediately. It was a waiting game now. A painful, haunting wait. Never forget. Over the next decade, Glenn Ellen changed. New families moved in. New students filled the halls of Glenbard West. But one thing didn't change. The memory of Christie Wesselman. Her story became local legend. Parents told their children to be careful in the woods. Coaches reminded athletes to run in pairs. And every few years, the case would resurface, covered again by local reporters, hoping to shake something loose. But the killer remained a ghost. Some believed he had left the state. Others feared he still lived nearby. Quiet, hidden, watching. Then in 2015, the silence shattered. 34 years. That's how long it had been since Christie Wesselman was murdered. An entire lifetime. For some, long enough to forget. But for Christie's family, for her mother, her brother, her friends, it was a wound that never closed. Until 2015, a name from the past. On July 1st, 2015, the DuPage County Sheriff's Office made a quiet, calculated move. They arrested a man, not for murder, but for an unrelated crime, a burglary. His name? Michael D. Jones, a 62-year-old man. Average, forgettable. He lived just across the border, in Carbondale, Illinois, far from Glen Ellen. A face that had long disappeared from local memory. But when he was processed at the county jail, deputies did something they were now required to do for all felony arrests. They took his DNA. They submitted it to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Just another sample in a sea of millions. But then the match hit. Michael D. Jones. The DNA profile taken from his cheek matched the one collected from Christy Wesselman's body 3 decades earlier. The reveal of a monster. Michael D. Jones had been hiding in plain sight. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger. He had lived in Glen Ellen. In the 1980s, he had even worked at a local grocery store at the time of Christie's murder. A local, a neighbor, a face that blended in. But Jones had a past, a dark, violent past. In fact, just 1 year before Christie was murdered, he had been convicted of sexual assault. He had attacked a 16-year-old girl in Wheaton, not far from Glen Ellen. The pattern was clear. And yet, back then, no one connected the dots. He was sentenced to just 6 years. He served 3. He was free by the summer of 1985. Free. When Christie went out for a run. The confession. Once confronted with the DNA evidence, Jones didn't deny it. He didn't claim innocence. He didn't beg. He confessed. He told detectives that he had seen Christie jogging alone that day. He said he approached her, claiming to be hurt. He used her kindness against her. When she stopped to help, he attacked. He dragged her off the trail and into the woods. He raped her. And when she tried to fight back, he strangled her. Then he left her there, in the dirt, in the woods, alone. He went home, washed up, and lived the next 30 years like nothing had happened. The arrest and charges. In November of 2015, Michael D. Jones was officially charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault in connection with the 1985 killing of Christy Wesselman. The news broke like wildfire. The quiet man from Carbondale who had once worked a checkout lane was now revealed to be a cold-blooded killer. Christy's mother, who had waited 3 decades for answers, finally got a name, a face, a person to hold accountable. And justice, at last, seemed within reach. The courtroom. In February 2016, Michael D. Jones stood before a judge, gray-haired, frail, but still capable of cruelty. He entered a guilty plea. No trial, no jury, just a quiet admission of guilt and a mother's long, anguished stare from the gallery. Guilty, he said, and with that word, spoken just once, 30 years of silence cracked. Narrator, emotional, slow. Christy's mother, Marian Wesselman, was there. She stared at the man who had stolen her daughter, her future, her joy. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just spoke Christy's name. One last time. The sentencing. Michael D. Jones was sentenced to 80 years in prison. He was 63 years old at the time. He will die behind bars. No parole. No redemption. No second chances. Just a cold cell, and the memory of the life he took. A family's final piece. After the sentencing, Marianne Wesselman spoke to reporters. Her voice was steady, her grief eternal. But there was closure now. A name, a confession, a face for the nightmare. We finally know who did this, she said, but it doesn't bring Christy back. Still, justice had arrived. Late, yes, but real. And for a family that had lived through darkness, it was enough to breathe again. The power of DNA. The case of Christy Wesselman is more than just a story of loss. It's a story about what happens when science, persistence, and the refusal to forget come together. If not for that one burglary in 2015, if not for the DNA sample, Michael D. Jones might have died a free man. He might have taken the secret to his grave, but he didn't. Because Christy wasn't forgotten, because justice doesn't expire, and because sometimes the truth doesn't die, Christy Wesselman was only 15 years old when her life was stolen. She never got to finish high school, never went to college, never had a first job, a first love, a chance to grow old. Everything she was, her laugh, her voice, her dreams, was frozen in time on that summer afternoon in 1985. Her friends remember her as kind, funny, driven. Her mother remembers a girl who loved music and art, who had so much potential, who was just starting to find her place in the world. But she never got the chance. And for 3 long decades, her name echoed in silence. A case gone cold, a family left shattered, the unseen wounds. The murder of a child is like an earthquake. It splits lives open, quietly, violently, and the aftershocks never truly end. Christy's brother carried the guilt of not walking with her that day. Her mother carried the weight of 100 what-ifs. Her friends grew older while she stayed 15. Forever. And the town of Glen Ellen? They never forgot. Not really. Behind every tree in Churchill Woods, behind every summer breeze, there was a memory. There was Christy, the monster among them. Michael D. Jones faded into the background after 1985, moved south, got older, lived a life. He wasn't a famous killer. He didn't leave a string of victims. Just one. But that one life, that one brutal act, it left a trail of decades-long devastation. And he would have gotten away with it if not for a routine burglary arrest, a DNA swab, a system finally working the way it should. He had thought time would protect him, that no one would remember. But he was wrong. A name cleared. For years, people in Glen Ellen whispered, was it someone from the school? Was it a stranger? Was it someone close? Rumors swirled. Suspicions destroyed friendships. The cloud of accusation hung heavy over innocent lives. But when Michael Jones confessed, that cloud lifted. The town finally had a name. They could stop wondering, stop doubting. They could finally start healing. The power of modern justice. The Christy Wesselman case is a landmark of modern forensics. Without DNA, without Cody's, without the quiet perseverance of investigators who never closed the file, there would have been no justice. This wasn't a lucky break. It was the result of a system slowly catching up, of laws that finally said, every voice matters, even if it's silent. Every state that requires DNA collection upon arrest, every cold case unit that keeps digging, every lab technician, every detective who refuses to give up, they made this possible. Marianne's promise. After the sentencing, Marianne Wesselman spoke not just for herself, but for every parent who's lost a child to violence. She became an advocate, a voice in the silence, a reminder that justice can be delayed, but it must never be denied. She fought for stronger laws, for DNA databases, for more support for victims' families. Her message was clear. You never stop loving them. You never stop fighting for them. And you never let them be forgotten. Remembering Christy. Today, there are memorials for Christy Wesselman. Plaques, trees, tributes. But the truest memorial? It's the stories her mother tells. The way her friends still speak her name. The way Glen Ellen still remembers that little girl who went for a run and never came home. In every cold case solved, in every family that finds closure after years of silence, Christy lives on. Closure, but not an end. Michael D. Jones is gone. He died in prison in 2021. He left behind no legacy, no sympathy, no forgiveness. But Christy Wesselman, she left behind a movement, a determination to bring justice, no matter how long it takes. Because her story isn't just about tragedy. It's about resilience. It's about a mother who never gave up, a community that never stopped asking questions, and a system that slowly, painfully found its voice. Final words. Christy went out for a run on July 21st, 1985. She never came back, but she was never truly gone. Not in the hearts of those who loved her. Not in the memory of Glen Ellen. And not in the justice that finally found her name. So here's to Christy Wesselman, a daughter, a sister, a friend, and now, at last, a name no longer lost to silence. Another case closed, but not forgotten, because behind every cold case is a real person. A life stolen, a family haunted, a name worth remembering. Christy Wesselman's story reminds us that justice might sleep, but it never dies. Not as long as someone is still asking questions, still fighting, still listening. If this story moved you, don't scroll past it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another unsolved case we drag back into the light. This isn't just true crime. It's truth that demands to be heard. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some killers hide in the shadows, but we don't stop until the truth steps into the light. This is Unsolved Crime Stories, where every silence has a voice. May 23rd, 1994, Rochester, New York. It was the kind of spring day that felt almost like summer, warm, golden, and deceptively safe. 4-year-old Kay Polton, known as Kay to her family and neighbors, couldn't contain her excitement. Clutching the handlebars of her little red tricycle, she pleaded with her mother, Judy, to let her ride outside before dinner. Judy hesitated. The yard was quiet, but not empty. Children from the apartment complex played tag under the fading sunlight. Mothers chatted from balconies, the smell of dinner drifting through open windows. Judy was at the kitchen table, folding leaflets into magazines for her evening delivery job, a task she'd nearly finished. She glanced at Kay, eyes bright with hope and innocence, and finally nodded. "Just a few minutes, sweetheart. Stay where I can see you." Kay grinned, the gap between her baby teeth showing, and pushed her tricycle toward the door. The wooden screen creaked shut behind her. Judy returned to her magazines, comforted by the familiar squeak of Kay's tricycle wheels outside. Those few minutes felt like nothing. Judy imagined what they'd do afterward. Finish the deliveries, maybe stop at McDonald's for fries. Kay loved the fries more than the toy in the Happy Meal. In her mind, it was already a perfect evening. But perfection shatters fast. When Judy finally stepped outside, the yard was still filled with sounds of children playing. But Kay's red tricycle was gone. The spot where she had last seen her daughter was empty, like a photograph where someone had been cut out. Judy called out, voice trembling, "Kay? Kay!" Silence. She scanned the courtyard, behind the swings, near the old oak tree, by the fence that bordered the highway. Nothing. No flash of a red tricycle, no glimpse of her little girl's yellow dress. The familiar squeak of tricycle wheels was gone too, replaced by the rushing noise of traffic beyond the fence. Judy's heartbeat quickened, fear rising like floodwater. She tried again, louder this time. "Kay, why?" Some neighbors turned. Faces that had been relaxed a moment ago now reflected her panic. One neighbor joined the search, then another. Parents called to their own children, asking if anyone had seen Kay. But the answer was always the same. They'd seen her moments ago, riding her tricycle near the others, and then nothing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Judy checked the laundry rooms, peered behind dumpsters, and even searched inside bushes that lined the complex. All the while, her mind battled terror. Maybe Kay had wandered out the gate, maybe she was hurt, maybe no, she couldn't finish that thought. Finally, trembling hands dialed 911. Police arrived quickly, sirens cutting through the still evening air. They asked the same questions Judy had asked, but the answers were still the same. No one had seen Kay leave the yard, and no one saw anyone suspicious. A canine unit joined the search, dogs sniffing for Kay's scent. Officers moved methodically, sweeping through stairwells, storage rooms, and parking spaces. The neighbors stood outside, whispering, faces pale. Judy could barely breathe. The complex sat close to a busy highway. A low fence separated the playground from traffic speeding by, not high enough to stop an adult. But Kay was careful, her mother insisted. Kay knew she wasn't allowed past the fence, and she had never disobeyed before. As night settled in, the search didn't stop. Flashlights cut through shadows, and police knocked on every door, asking the same desperate question. "Have you seen this little girl?" Residents opened their doors without hesitation. Those who weren't home had their doors unlocked by the complex manager. Judy's legs felt numb from walking, her voice raw from shouting. Every passing minute felt heavier, pressing on her chest. She thought of Kay's favorite stuffed bear, still on her bed. She imagined Kay, crying somewhere, afraid, calling out for her mother. By 4 a.m., after hours of fruitless searching, police made it official. The case was reclassified as a suspected kidnapping. The word crashed into Judy's mind like cold water. Kidnapping. The morning sun brought no relief. Judy watched as detectives gathered in hushed circles, exchanging notes. Firefighters climbed onto rooftops, peering into dumpsters from above. Officers used poles to check ponds and drainage ditches. The smell of wet grass and gasoline filled the air. Reporters began to arrive, cameras capturing Judy's pale face and trembling hands. But Judy didn't care about the cameras. She wanted answers. Where was her daughter? Who could have taken her? And why? As neighbors comforted her, Judy felt something else rising in her chest, dread mixed with suspicion. She looked around the familiar faces in the courtyard, people she'd smiled at, people whose kids played with Kay. One of them could be the reason her daughter was gone. And as police continued to search, that dark possibility began to feel terrifyingly real. The danger wasn't a stranger from outside. It had always been here, lurking next door. Night fell over Rochester, but the search didn't stop. Flashlights bobbed through dark corners of the apartment complex as police, firefighters, and neighbors combed every inch for little Kay. Judy's voice cracked from shouting her daughter's name, yet silence answered every plea. Detectives knocked on doors, questioning everyone. Had anyone seen Kay? Had anyone noticed a stranger? But answers dissolved into hopeless shrugs. The playground was full just moments before, and then she was gone. Tension grew heavy as the minutes turned to hours. Judy's hope clashed with horror. A low fence near the highway now looked like a gaping hole to danger. But Kay knew her boundaries. She would never cross them. Judy's mind circled the same question. If Kay didn't leave on her own, who took her? By dawn, the case officially turned from missing child to possible kidnapping. The word itself felt sharp, cruel, impossible. Judy stood in the yard where Kay had last ridden her tricycle, her heart pounding like it might burst. Somewhere out there, her little girl was alone. And every passing second felt like a lifetime. Detectives urged the public to come forward with tips. Flyers were printed. News cameras rolled. Judy pleaded through tears. Please, if anyone knows anything, help bring my baby home. And to everyone watching this story unfold now, don't scroll past. Share this video. Keep Kay's story alive. Help bring awareness so no child is ever forgotten. Subscribe for more true crime stories. Together, your voice can make a difference. The apartment complex where Kay vanished had over 300 units. A tight-knit suburban maze where faces were familiar, routines predictable. It seemed unthinkable that someone living among them could be hiding a dark secret. But investigators knew. If Kay was abducted, the perpetrator likely wasn't a stranger. So detectives went door to door. Every resident was questioned. Apartments were searched. Some were vacant, but management provided master keys. They checked attics, closets, basements, anywhere a small child could fit. Nothing. No signs of struggle. No broken locks. No tricycle. Kay had simply vanished. But Judy had a name. Mark Christie, a 22-year-old neighbor who lived just a few doors down with his young wife and toddler. Judy told police his behavior had always made her uncomfortable. He once commented out of the blue that her daughter was the prettiest of all the girls in the complex, and not in a passing, friendly way. His tone sent a chill down her spine. She remembered another conversation. Mark had asked her a question that still echoed in her mind. Would Kay tell you if someone tried to touch her? It had stopped her cold. She had scooped her daughter up and left the playground without another word. From that day forward, Kay was no longer allowed near him, not even to play with his son. Detectives immediately flagged Mark as a person of interest. They brought him in for questioning. He was calm, cooperative. He denied everything, said he hadn't seen Kay that evening. Then came the polygraph. Mark passed. No deception detected. Still, something didn't sit right. Judy remembered seeing him just minutes after Kay disappeared. He was outside, walking with his son. But one detail stood out. His shoes. The laces were missing. Why would a man walk outside wearing sneakers without laces? Why that day? And why hadn't anyone else noticed? But the lack of hard evidence meant Mark couldn't be held. Police had already searched his apartment and found nothing. And with a clean polygraph and no witness placing him with Kay, they had to let him go. Meanwhile, the public began speculating. Was this a stranger abduction? Could someone have driven into the complex, taken Kay in broad daylight, and left unnoticed? But the place was busy. Children were outside. Parents were watching. It didn't make sense. And neither did Mark. Judy couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was saying. And if you think Mark's story is over, think again. Stay with us as this mystery unfolds. And if you believe this story deserves justice, give it a like and share it. Someone out there knows something. Weeks turned into months, and the shock turned into a gnawing ache. Judy's face became a fixture on local news. A mother refusing to give up, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Please, bring my baby home." Flyers with Kay's smiling face covered telephone poles, supermarket doors, and bus stops. Volunteers joined the search. Tips flooded in, over 1,000 leads. Each call sparked a flicker of hope, but every investigation led nowhere. The same question haunted everyone. How could a child vanish without a trace? Detectives chased theories. A stranger sneaking into the complex, a family dispute, even Judy herself. The lack of evidence fueled whispers and doubts. But Judy knew. Her daughter didn't just walk away. Someone had taken her. The case turned cold, but Judy's resolve didn't. She quit her job, spending every hour hunting for answers. She talked to reporters, taped flyers to passing trucks, even convinced airlines to place missing child notices in ticket envelopes. She appeared on national television, her voice trembling yet fierce. If you know something, anything, speak up. Donations poured in, and a $100,000 reward was offered for information. Yet, despite the attention, Kay's tricycle was never found. No new witnesses emerged, and the apartment complex, once filled with laughter and summer games, felt forever darker. But then, nearly 2 years later, a crack appeared in the silence. A woman called 911, her voice shaking as she spoke of a confession from her own husband, Mark Christie. Detectives had always suspected him. Now they had a chance. But would it be enough to finally reveal what really happened to Kay? Or would the truth remain buried? If you're still watching, don't stop here. Hit the like button, subscribe, and share the story. Kay deserves to be remembered, and someone, somewhere, may hold the missing piece. The call that changed everything came from the last person detectives expected, Mark Christie's wife. Shaken and terrified, she told them Mark had confessed during a heated argument he had killed little Kay. Detectives felt the surge of hope clash with frustration. Under state law, confessions made between spouses were protected. They couldn't arrest Mark based on her word alone. But Detective Crow wasn't ready to let go. He had known Mark since the early investigation, when Mark had seemed strangely confident, even proud of fooling police. Crow tracked Mark down to a town 50 miles away. At first, Mark's mother blocked the door, saying he wouldn't talk without a lawyer. But eventually Mark stepped out and Crow, staying calm and friendly, persuaded him to meet at a nearby restaurant. Over coffee, Crow played to Mark's ego, the idea that he had outsmarted everyone. Slowly, Mark's guarded posture faded. He admitted he still saw Kay's face in every newspaper, every flyer. And then, almost casually, Mark shared how he had hidden Kay's tricycle, dismantling it, scattering the pieces where police wouldn't look, and slipping past checkpoints unnoticed. Crow knew he was close to the truth, but he had to be careful. He suggested maybe Kay's death had been an accident, an idea Mark didn't deny. Finally, Mark admitted it. He had strangled Kay. The chilling calmness in his voice betrayed no guilt, only relief at finally speaking it aloud. If you're following this heartbreaking journey, stay with us. Click like, subscribe, and share. Because even after all this time, the story isn't over. The next chapter reveals where Mark hid Kay's body and how justice finally caught up. Mark's confession sent chills through Detective Crow, but there was still a missing piece. What had he done with Kay's body? Gently, Crow pressed further, keeping the conversation calm and almost friendly. Mark finally revealed his chilling plan. After strangling Kay, he placed her body in a laundry basket and covered it with clothes. Then, as chaos consumed the apartment complex, he walked past neighbors searching desperately for the missing girl, and no one noticed. He loaded the basket into his car and drove off with his young son in tow, pretending everything was normal. At his workplace, Mark carried Kay's body to a massive industrial tank filled with liquid coolant. Standing on top of the 30,000-gallon tank, he tied a heavy metal object to her small frame and dropped her inside. Then he disposed of her clothes, but not her earrings. Returning home, he joined the search, acting like a concerned neighbor. Detective Crow listened, hiding his anger and sorrow, knowing he needed every detail. Mark admitted the murder was a mistake, but his cold recounting betrayed little remorse. When asked why, Mark couldn't answer. The truth, he had fooled everyone for 2 years, until guilt finally cracked his mask. Police searched the tank. Inside, they found Kay's remains, almost 2 years after she disappeared. Finally, Judy got to bury her daughter. Mark was arrested and later sentenced to 25 years in prison. Don't stop here. Hit like, subscribe, and share this video to keep Kay's story alive, because what happened next reveals an even darker past. Just when it seemed the case was over, another chilling twist emerged. In 2010, detectives reopened an old cold case, the 1988 murder of 74-year-old Viola Manville. She had been brutally attacked while walking through a quiet Rochester neighborhood. At the time, a young man named Frank Sterling had confessed after a grueling interrogation and had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. But doubts about his guilt had never completely faded. As new DNA testing methods became available, investigators decided to re-examine the evidence. The results were shocking. The DNA didn't match Frank Sterling. It matched Mark Christie, Kay's killer. In 2011, under pressure from the evidence, Mark confessed to Viola's murder. At just 16 years old, he had beaten the elderly woman to death, a crime he had hidden for more than 2 decades. For this second murder, Mark received an additional 28-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, Frank Sterling, who had always maintained his innocence, was finally released after 19 years of wrongful imprisonment. He later received nearly $10 million in compensation, but the years stolen from him could never truly be repaid. Tragically, Frank died of a heart attack just 3 years after regaining his freedom. Mark Christie, the man who had fooled everyone for so long, remains in prison and may one day be eligible for parole. But the scars he left behind on 2 families and an entire community will never heal. If you've followed this far, don't stop now. Like, subscribe, and share to ensure these victims are never forgotten, and to help shed light on the dark corners where justice can sometimes fail. The case of Kay Polton began with a seemingly ordinary day, a child riding her tricycle on a sunny evening, and ended with a horrifying revelation of hidden darkness. For 2 long years, her mother searched tirelessly, hoping for answers. When the truth finally emerged, it revealed not just a single crime, but a pattern of violence that had started years before. Mark Christie's chilling confessions uncovered the murder of Kay, and decades earlier, the brutal killing of Viola Manville, a crime that had led to the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent man, Frank Sterling. Frank's release after 19 years came too late to give him back the life stolen from him, and he passed away just 3 years later. This story is a sobering reminder of how evil can hide behind an ordinary face, and how easily justice can go astray when evidence is overlooked or confessions are coerced. While Mark Christie remains behind bars, the pain he caused ripples on touching families, investigators, and an entire community that will never forget. Thank you for following this case to the end. If you believe stories like this should be told and remembered, please like, subscribe, and share, because even the darkest stories deserve to be brought into the light. Each of these cases is a chilling reminder that even in the darkest moments, the truth has a way of coming to light. Behind every headline was a life lost too soon, and families who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. If these stories moved you, remember, your voice keeps these victims' memories alive. Like this video to show your support, subscribe for more true crime stories that dig deeper than the headlines, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop seeking the truth.